Welcome to the 8th Annual Animal Legal Defense Fund Student Convention. I really want to start by giving a great thanks to ALDF's Animal Law Program and events team for organizing such an excellent event today. You're in for a real treat. And I hope you're all enjoying that delicious plant-based breakfast. And I'd also like to thank Ethan Brown and Beyond Meat for graciously donating the vegan sausage patties and links that you're eating right now. And let you know that Beyond Meat's founder, Ethan Brown, will be giving the keynote address at our banquet on Saturday night. So for those of you attending, he's an incredibly inspiring animal advocate who kind of decided that business was the best vehicle for him to have a great impact. So he's been a wonderful supporter of animal law in the field and just the whole issue in general. So yeah, I hope you can check that out. But today you are in for a real treat with the wonderful panels and presentations that have been put together, such as this awesome opening one that features some of my dearest friends and colleagues, including Cheryl Leahy, who I actually first met when she was a law student like you all and competing in the national animal law competitions. And I will not say how many years ago that was. But speaking of which, I'd also am excited to announce that this year we're going to be adjusting the timing of the recently resurrected animal law competitions so that the final rounds will happen here live at next year's Animal Student Convention. So these competitions are such a wonderful opportunity to learn more about the law, to practice your practical lawyering skills, and interact with such amazing leading lawyers in the field. So you can expect to hear more about that from us shortly, but please keep your ears open because it is just a really incredible opportunity for you all to engage. And I also want to give my gratitude to the Brooks Institute for Animal Law and Policy, Pam Frasch from the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School, and Delcy Winders from Vermont Law School for really helping get the animal law competitions resurrected after an absence. I also encourage you to use today to build some meaningful collaborative relationships with each other and mingle with folks from the other SALDEF chapters. You'll learn some great skills during today's networking panel, Power Hour, hosted by ALDF's own Chief People Officer, Beth Nacarado. Definitely pay close attention to that and use what you learn to interact with all of the incredible lawyers, academics, and leaders from the animal law movement who will be here this weekend. It really is a wonderful opportunity to just learn what you can from them, and they're all really open to having you approach them and just ask them because you all really represent the future of animal law and the broader animal protection movement. Having spent the last 8 years myself overseeing Harvard Law School's animal law program, I deeply understand how valuable you all are, not just to the future, but what you can actually engage in now, still while you're students, through engaging in local and national advocacy, hosting events to help educate others, and just building broader networks. That's why events like today's are so important and incredibly, I just feel really humbled and honored to be here and so excited that so many of you shown up. We've got a wonderful full room. And again, you all are the future of animal law. And I just couldn't be more grateful for you taking the time out of your lives to come here and just use this opportunity to learn as much as you can, but also to teach us all by sharing your own perspective. So thank you for taking time and please enjoy the weekend. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. And big thank you to our ALDF events team, Anne-Marie, Jody, Megan, Liberty. Really could not do this without you. So again, big round of applause for all of them. And thank you so much to the catering and AV teams. I'm so excited to be moderating this morning's career panel with some leading animal law experts and just terrific people, truly. Within animal law, this last year has, of course, had some setbacks, but some great successes, some challenges, but also a lot of new opportunities. And while this work can be hard, there's always such a bright light cast from its shores. And I really credit all of you for blazing so brightly for this movement and being here today. I've had a few people ask me recently what brings me the most joy and happiness in my work, and it's you all. Every single time, the answer is students, so thank you. When my colleague Nicole and I first started kind of coming up with what would a student convention look like? What would you all want to see? Would you really want to spend your day with us? We had a lot of high hopes, but we really weren't sure what to expect. That first student convention was actually hosted here, but quite a few stories up in 2017, and it was met with so much love, and it's only continued to grow, and it's been so worthwhile to see how you all plan for it and get excited for it and engaged. So thank you. And with that said, I have high expectations that you all will be asking good questions today and really engaged, introducing yourself, and just putting yourself out there. So how today will work with our career panel is our panelists will briefly introduce themselves and include some career highlights about their work experiences, and then we'll get right into Q&A. I have some questions to start with, but I'd love to hear yours. So at any time, you can go to either of these microphone stands and form a line, ask your questions. All right. And your questions can be about just about anything, curriculum planning, interview prep, you know, what it's like to work in our roles, pro bono opportunities, anything like that. All right, so with us today is Ever Chinoda, founder of Speak Out for Animals, Katie Kraska, former director of federal legislation at the ASPCA, Cheryl Leahy, executive director for Animal Outlook, and Manny Ritnell, Colorado State Representative. So we're going to start with Ever and just say a few brief introductions.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I am Eva Chinoda, founder and director of Speak Out for Animals, an organization that is registered in USA as a 501c3 and also registered in Zimbabwe, where I come from, Botswana, Namibia, Zambia, which is the SADC region in Africa. And I did the registration and I do some work there because I had the first mover advantage. I was the first Southern African lawyer to study a master's in animal law. So that gave me a competitive advantage. And our work is basically formal education. I teach at 2 law schools. I introduced wildlife law as a module. It's the only university that teaches wildlife law in Africa. And I also run 2 student clubs at the 2 universities for 7 years now. And we're also involved in case monitoring. We go to the court, work with the prosecutors, make sure there's no corruption, make sure that cases are being concluded on time. And we're also into literature development. Animal law is a new field of law. So students need case law, they need things to read. So I'm always looking for information. And also judges, prosecutors, police, they need things to refer to. So we are also into literature development. And also the last thing we do is training, capacity building. I've trained police, magistrates, judges, prosecutors on animal law, wildlife law, and environmental law. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ever. Cheryl?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I can't hear myself that well. I'm Cheryl Leahy. I'm Executive Director of Animal Outlook. I'm actually in my transitioning out process, and our new Executive Director is also going to be here, so you get to meet both of us. So I can also talk career transition, so that's fun. Animal Outlook focuses on farmed animals. We have 4 programs: undercover investigations, legal advocacy, farm transitions, meaning getting animal farmers out of farming animals and into farming plants, and vegan outreach and mainstreaming, sort of the culture change side of it. Within the legal advocacy, you'll hear more about this if you come to the panel tomorrow about this, but the basic structure is we are using laws to address systemic harms, sort of ultimately with an abolitionist goal. And that generally falls into 2 categories. One is using the laws that currently exist that are meant to address animal cruelty. And that often leverages our undercover investigations essentially as the raw data or the evidence to do that. and also litigation that may or may not use causes of action that were ever intended for protecting animals, but oftentimes where the underlying harm is a harm to the animal and where we're sort of relying indirectly on the fact that cruelty laws exist or similar things. And the idea with those is also to be basically creating replicable models. So if it's something that, the private bar is unlikely to sort of jump into on their own, being able to show that it can be done often then causes more people to come out and do similar cases. So there's always sort of a thought process about how are we building this field, how are we maximizing the impact for animals in our legal advocacy. Yeah, and then I've also taught at UCLA. I taught the farm animal law seminar, and I worked in their animal law and food law program. So happy to answer questions about that side of things as well.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Manny.
Hey, everybody. My name is Manny Rutinel. I'm a state representative over in Colorado. Oh, now I can hear myself. That's nice. I just want to, at the top, give a shout out to whoever brought in Just Egg into the breakfast area. If you are what you eat, I'm like 15 to 20% Just Egg.
That would be Megan.
Okay,
Yep.
shout out to Priscilla then. Thank you.
Oh, Megan. Mhm.
And Megan.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to find Megan afterwards. So I'm a state representative in Colorado. I also co-teach an animal law course at University of Denver Law School. Before I was a legislator, I was an environmental attorney with Earth Justice. My whole job was to take on large meat corporations and sue them for all they're worth, to defend low-income people of color that were subjected to the environmental injustices of those factory farms that they were responsible for holding up. Before then, I was in law school, and in law school, I got to intern at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. I got to intern with Brighter Green, which is another organization that's in the environmental and animal space. I also started my own startup in law school because of, at my law school, there was this lab or clinic that was basically dedicated to coming up with ideas and then trying to implement them. And so it was the Climate, Animals, Food, and Environment Law and Policy Lab. And I came up with a startup. And when the pandemic hit, instead of paying $80,000 a year for Zoom Law School, I decided to take a year off and dedicate my time to that startup and work on the a Senate campaign in Colorado and the Georgia runoff election. So if you ever have an opportunity to take time off in the middle of the pandemic, I highly recommend it. And then before law school, I was an economist for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and got to intern at the Humane Society of the United States in their policy division. And then in college, I was a campus coordinator with the Humane League. And that's it. Excited to chat.
Thank you, Manny. And Katie?
I'm really the relatable one up here. I don't know what I'm doing with all of these people that are so impressive. So my name's Katie Kraska. I am currently a 2L at Harvard Law School across the country. But before that, I was working for the ASPCA for quite a few years. I was the director of federal legislation there. And I had sort of a strange winding path to getting into the belly of the beast of DC. I actually spent a semester abroad in East Africa, in Kenya and Tanzania. I was super interested in international animal issues, but I think once I got there, it made me realize how much of US policy we're exporting to other places and how a lot of the problems could probably be solved here first, and then that would have an effect in other places. So I spent another year abroad on a US Fulbright research grant in Indonesia. If you're interested in that program, please let me know. I'm an ambassador for the program, and it's very, very cool. You essentially get money from the government to just go work on a project, and you don't have to do anything at the end. It's pretty amazing. And it's all about relationship building, which is super important. And so then I did my master's degree at the London School of Economics, and I was focused on ethics and public policy. Working in philosophy in London is exactly what it sounds like. It's just a lot of drunken arguing, and you're in the middle of London. It was great. Highly recommend doing something abroad. So if you're interested in international stuff, feel free to let me know. And then I decided that like the policy world in DC was where I needed to be, moved there, started at the ASPCA as an intern and just kind of worked my way through the ranks. Working in federal lobbying is really, really taxing, as you all probably know. 2017 was a very strange time to start lobbying in DC. Really cut my teeth in a very weird world. So nowhere to go but up, I suppose, from there. And I saw the evolution of a lot of really interesting laws, and we made progress on a lot of things, but I'm also really interested in talking to folks about like burnout and work-life balance and making sure that your mental health is staying in like the big picture conversation as you try to make progress for animals. So yeah, very excited to be here.
Thank you, Katie and Elle. Perfect. And as many of you probably know, I recognize so many faces here, but for those who don't, I am Priscilla Rader-Kolb. I'm the Senior Law School Programs Attorney with the Animal Legal Defense Fund. And I am always happy to chat about anything animal law related. So please don't be shy and introduce yourselves if you haven't already met. Okay. So I have a question to kick off for everyone. I'm going to start with Katie. How did you get started in animal law as a student? What resources or opportunities are there that you found most helpful?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, first and foremost, what you're doing right now is super important, like sitting in rooms with people and mixing and mingling with like not only the people that are up on stages and talking, but also like your fellow students, because they are going to go out into the world and like do really, really cool stuff like very soon. So making sure that you have like those relationships built. Like I'm very good friends with a lot of the lobbyists in DC that are working in various animal welfare capacities, like some for nonprofits and some not. And those types of relationships are just irreplaceable. So I would say that focusing on like putting people first is really, really important. And putting yourselves in the right rooms where people are talking about the things that you want to talk about. And definitely don't be shy. Like people, as you all probably know, like love to talk about themselves. So if you reach out to like academics, or if you reach out to folks that are working in the field, like starting at a conference and looking them up and saying like, who is this person? Who did they work for? What is their path? And then reach out to that individual person or to the organization or company that they've been working for, whether it's like a startup, whether it's a litigation firm, whatever. Don't be shy.
Great answer. Manny?
Yeah, so I got involved in the animal advocacy space, maybe in college with that campus coordinator position with the Humane League. And that was a really instrumental part of my sort of career because one, it allowed me to feel like I was a part of the movement, and it sort of solidified my identity within the movement. But two, my supervisor was this person named Rachel Atchison. It may be a name that you hear frequently, but Rachel is one of the most incredible advocates in the animal space in the entire world. And she is a super connector, and she is so incredibly generous. And so I never sort of thought that I had mentors in my life, but looking back, I realized that Rachel helped guide me in many ways, connect me to a lot of people, made me feel welcomed in the movement. And the insight that she was able to give me and the connections that she was able to give me were extremely instrumental. And so I started going to conferences in large part because of her. I started thinking of myself as an advocate within the movement because of her. And I completely agree with Katie that the relationships that you have will be the most important piece of your career, regardless of the movement that you're a part of. But especially, I think, in the animal advocacy space, because it's so small and tight-knit. And so the connections that you have will stay with you for your entire career. So going to events like this is extremely valuable. Meeting with people in school, is this recorded? Okay. I always went to class and I always did my work. But then after I did that, I would always hang out with as many of my student friends, and especially the folks that were also interested in this space, because again, it's super tight knit. So these are the folks that are going to stay with you for your entire career. So That's what I'll say.
Yeah, I think both of those responses are really good. My comments are sort of along similar lines. One thing I'll say is what's very cool about animal law is that it has these sort of blurry borders, right? Like it is not a defined, field of law, even movement. I mean, it's changing all the time. I was very lucky and naive. When I was in college, I did environmental studies, and the head of the department was perfectly fine with me being like, well, animal rights is part of this. And so I was able to do a lot of like original research and writing and reaching out to people kind of under the umbrella of the environmental movement, using a lot of what I was learning and people I was meeting, just kind of focused on animal rights. So, use those adjacent movements and those adjacent skill building opportunities that you have. The other thing I'll say is like talk to people. I mean, this sounds silly, but it is not hard to have a very active animal law student group in law school with 2 people, and to find a few $1,000s to be able to bring people in to give talks. Oftentimes, we're in the Zoom universe now. That's fine, but I've always said when all the Zoom thing started, I was like, Zoom is like the uncanny valley of human relationships. Like you think that you're really talking to a person and that you're having, a conversation, but I've seen just the trust break down over Zoom, and then you see a person in person and you're like, having a wonderful conversation and you're, kind of supporting each other and respecting each other. Bring people in person. And then when you do bring people in person, one thing that we did in our animal law student group is we took them to dinner after and just peppered them with questions, just would not let them leave unless that we got real practical information about them. And that allowed me to really map out what was the field, what was the direction that it was going, who were the people in it, what were they doing. And people are very generous with their time. They do want to talk about this kind of thing. It is still a relatively small world and small movement, and we need more creative thinking in it and more sort of entry points in it. So use that opportunity. And then I'll just second also what Chris said about the animal law competitions. I mean, it's a super important way, not just to build relationships, but to build those skills. It can be a really immersive, kind of intense experience, but it can also really pump up your energy about it.
Thank you. Evan?
Thank you. So unlike most of the people who practice animal law, I didn't plan to do animal law. I found myself being in animal law. My first interaction was in 2012 when I just had finished college, and I was asked to volunteer at the Department of Parks and Wildlife. They didn't have a legal department then, but they just wanted a paper pusher. We just want somebody who did law to file, to photocopy, to print. And I said, okay, I can't go to law school to just file and print. But then I did that for 6 months. But when I was at a Parks and Wildlife department, I knew nothing about this world of animal law, 2012. Fast forward, I then went to prosecution. So I prosecuted for 4 years, but because I'd volunteered at Parks, the Parks would always call me at my prosecution office to say, we've got this pangolin case, this ivory case, what's the section, what do you think? So I was remotely involved, but just doing the work. And then Cecil the Lion happened, and I was called from Parks and Wildlife to say, we've got this huge case that's going on, and we want you to come and help us with the prosecution. But for me, it was, okay, who doesn't want, Cecil was big. And so I went and joined the department again, and then fast forward, got a scholarship from Lewis and Clark because of the work that I was doing, started the nonprofit organization. So my point is just, number one, voluntary work. I started as a volunteer. I didn't even know about this field. Even when I got the opportunity and the scholarship to do this, to do animal law, at first I was like, what is animal law? Like, am I going to study dogs and cats? And what am I going to do with that when I go back to Africa where we value wildlife? But I came and I learned and then developed until where I am now, where animal law is my life. It's part of my career. So voluntary work and also the more you do it, the more you really, you know, discover yourself. You might feel like, okay, I want to do environmental law, but things will push you into animal law specifically, or you might think, I want to pursue animal law, and you find yourself doing environmental law, but there's a nexus between these two things, and you might be an environmental lawyer, but still being an animal lawyer because these two are connected. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so true to put yourself out there, take those chances. And, you know, it's okay to change your dreams if you discover something new about yourself, about a strength, about something you enjoy. So I really love that. All right, so you can start lining up at either of those microphones. I'm gonna start cold calling on people. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. Okay. So Manny, what would you suggest for curriculum planning, and how did you go about like choosing your classes, selection? Do you have any tips about, you know, did you go heavy on bar prep courses? Did you go heavy on your interests? Was there a mix? And then we can pass that question along to others after.
Great. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I went to all of my classes and had perfect attendance at all of them and thought they were essential. Now, let me get into another perspective that I could have on classes, and that is that I think 90% of what you learn in a class, you're going to forget. You're probably going to forget it like as soon as you take that test. And then you'll probably forget 99% by the next month. And so I actually don't know how valuable I thought classes were from a learning perspective. I thought clinics were important for me because that allowed me to really contribute into a movement in ways that forced me to learn, in ways that forced me to really do the work and do it well on behalf of a client or an organization, whoever it may be. I think I tend to think that it's not what you know, it's who you know. And so I would spend a lot of my time working on behalf of the Yale Animal Law Society, which is our ALDF chapter, the Yale Environmental Law Association, all these groups, the student groups that I was running, bringing in folks like, you know, like Animal Outlook folks or ALDF folks into the conversation, presenting them to my fellow students so that they could learn and then I could learn in that process. So I feel like I learned a lot more from my extracurriculars than I did in my classes. That being said, in my role as a state representative, there was a course called legislation, and maybe in different schools it's called something different, like statutory interpretation or something like that. I guess that was useful. Honestly, I'm not so sure. There's like nonpartisan staffers that draft everything for me. Having a law degree does most of the work, where I can just like point to the fact that I have a law degree and then people respect me more because of it. They think that I'm going to catch a lot more stuff than I probably would otherwise. So it acts as like a deterrent effect. From my perspective, spend as much as your time with fellow students, with folks who you're interested in like learning more from. And the bar, I don't know, you're going to learn everything you need for the bar like the summer right before law school. So I think you're probably going to be fine. So focus on everything else besides classes.
That's pretty much all you need to know. So we're done here. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll just jump in. For me, because I was an international student, I prioritized courses which I felt would be relevant when I go back home. But unfortunately, you know, they'll always give you a list where even if you want to, you'll find yourself doing some other things, which you know, like learning about, you know, American law. And I was wondering, what am I going to use this I mean, what am I going to use this for? So I prioritized courses which I felt were relevant. And from the courses which I felt were relevant, some of them I then learned, okay, this is not going to be as useful as the title or the module appears to be. But one thing that I learned, I think my animal law career is centered on one module or on one sentence. I push for the value of animals, the intrinsic and extrinsic value of animals. And with that message, I've sailed through any other form of animal law issue that comes up. And maybe the last issue would be, so from the courses that I chose, 2016, I did environmental law. I learned about the Clean Air Act, EPA, and I'm like, gosh, this is hard. And what am I going to do with this info? 6, 7 years later, right now I'm working on an environmental prosecution manual. And I was like, best practices, EPA, let's do this. So it's the information, some of the information you learn in class is not immediately relevant. But if you learn, you learn. It will come up 10 years, 7 years later. You're not as bad as somebody who didn't take the class. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I will second that. I think animal law, it's great to take the animal law class that most law schools offer. I mean, it's nice that there are law schools that have animal law clinics and they have additional classes and all that stuff. But oftentimes that isn't where you're getting the most practical information. I think clinics in general are great, like 100% take a clinic. But what I sort of think of, animal law will touch on all different sorts of substantive areas of law, and you don't know at the time that you're just sort of getting the information. And, I'll often have a flashback to some law school class and be like, oh, this is weirdly coming into play today in my life. Who knew? But I do think just taking a step back from, there's a difference between the law skills you're learning in law school and being an animal lawyer. Law, I mean, I don't mean this to be sort of defeatist, but law doesn't work for animals, right? So we have a broken system that we're working with. We are trying to use law both from sort of an internal, like, be a good lawyer, take good cases, come up with a strategy where you're working across an arc to actually move the needle for the animals. And we're using each case as an opportunity to put a mirror to society and say, this system is terrible. Look at what's happening. So kind of like what Manny said about kind of like the cachet of being a lawyer, we have that ability to take that language and really be an activist, just in a lawyer costume. And I think we have to do that while we're also being strong lawyers, right? So you have to live both kind of lives. And I think that means when you're in law school, you're thinking about those other sorts of skills. Well, how do I tell this story? How do I take this to the media? How do I, build kind of a movement? And that isn't always an opportunity. It's not always obvious how you do that. But the last thing I'll say, and I didn't kind of necessarily realize it at the time, is having that mindset allows better critical thinking for any kind of class you're taking in law school. So, you may hear very abstract concepts. I remember taking property law and being like, what is this? Like, it's coming from the weirdest place. I don't even like the idea of like rich people basically being able to protect their assets after they're dead. Like, what? Right? It's so abstract, and you don't have the context and you don't have the kind of moral grounding to really grab onto. But then you put the animal, like, okay, well, we have miscategorized animals in this society, right? You put that lens on it, and now you can actually speak and think intelligently about some of the underlying values that brought the law to where you're looking at it, right? It's no longer like the Romans thought about it this way or whatever. And I think you have to keep your head there while you are also absorbing, the actual structure of the law, because you're creating a scaffolding basically for what you're going to fill in then later.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think that there's sort of two recommendations that I would make related to taking classes. And One of them is that taking classes that like aren't in your interest area can help you be aware of things that you would not be aware of before. Like I didn't know what antitrust was before I went to law school. And now it's this massive movement in the animal space that like has the potential to like make really big impact. And like, I would imagine that maybe 10 years ago, there weren't a lot of like animal lawyers out there who knew much about antitrust work or were very familiar with like SEC regulations, things like that. So like tax law, I don't know, any sort of dimension of law can be relevant to animals if you make it relevant. And especially when you're working in the policy space, like being able to think creatively and say, oh, well, natural resources is a really hard committee for us. We don't want to send things there. Like maybe we should send things to Ways and Means because it's a friendlier committee. How can we make this like tax law help animals in some way or whatever? So thinking creatively and having those skills and that foundation is really, really important. So you can be sort of like a mile wide and an inch deep and at least have that like understanding. Like my perspective is a bit different because I did things in reverse. Like I was lobbying first, and when, for example, like the Horse Racing Integrity Act, there were constitutional challenges to that. There are still constitutional challenges to that being dealt with in the Fifth Circuit and other circuits. There's a split right now. I was lobbying on that bill and I had no idea what like a circuit split was, you know? So those types of things are really important. It's really helpful, I think, to understand like the foundation of the law. You don't have to be an expert in every area, but just understanding those dynamics and what can be beneficial. And then the other thing is that the classes that you take and like the people that you're doing research assistantships for, like building relationships with, like that is your narrative. Like you're building your narrative by what classes you're taking, what you're interested in, who you're working with. So in that way, like if you go take a bunch of classes about mergers and acquisitions and then you apply for I don't know, like a policy role, they're going to be like, okay, what's this about? So just think about how you're like aligning yourself on your resume, on your transcript, to be able to tell a good story about yourself and why you want to go into this field.
Great answers. Thank you all so much. And would you mind saying your name and school before your question? Thank you for waiting.
Of course, no, thank you. My name is Anthony. I'm coming from FIU Law 2L right now. First, I want to shout out, of course, our Saldiv chapter, our President Yesenia, and then our e-board, including Gavi, Victoria, and then member Jeff, like me. I wanted to ask in relation to a lot of what y'all were talking about. So we're from Florida, and this year we're going to be voting on an amendment to constitutionalize the right to fishing and hunting. I didn't realize until 5 minutes ago that that's already a thing in 22 other states. So I wanted to know in that regard, when it comes to state either guarantees or state legislation that guarantees, you know, one would argue a certain level of exploitation of animals, how you work within that state system, and alternatively, what ways you kind of work around those policies to still fight for, you know, either better treatment of animals within that or alternatively removing that exploitation in the first place.
I can get us started. Thanks for that. Thanks for that question, Anthony. So first I'll say that I think that some of the biggest wins that the animal movement has been at the state level. Like the cage-free movements, for instance, is the big one that comes to mind. And these direct to voter ballot initiatives, I think, have been instrumental in that, because what the animal rights movement does is it sort of gets some big wins, like in California or Massachusetts, on these confinement policies, and then they win by like 70 to 30 or something like that. And then they can go to other states that have these direct to democracy opportunities and say, hey, do you really want to spend $10 million trying to oppose this thing that's ultimately going to pass 70 to 30? Or can we just let this go through the legislative process and I'll give you a little extra year or two for implementation? So, but clearly, like you said, it sort of can go both ways where, you know, the animal rights movement can propose policies at the ballot, but so can perhaps other groups. And I think that on net, it's a much bigger win for animals because I think the broader population is very much in favor of animal rights. And we don't see that reflected in our legislative process because everything related to animals goes through the Ag Committee, which is dominated by, even in very democratic states, dominated by rural Democrats that have more conservative, entrenched farm interests. And so to your question about navigating these states' rights issues, I'm not sure how that looks on the litigation side. All I've been able to see is the successes that we've been able to have with the Prop 12 Supreme Court case, even though it's a little murky based on the decision, and it still leaves open the opportunity for the meat industry to come back in another way. But it seems to be something that I think a lot of these groups are navigating. So curious to hear if y'all have any additional thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I see states as a huge opportunity and also super difficult to navigate because you have some states that are being so progressive in some senses, and then some states that are being so regressive in some senses. And like there could potentially be opportunities for the feds to get involved if that mismatch becomes like too tenuous, right? Like that would be a decent justification to get some movement at the federal level. But otherwise, I think another strategy, if we're talking about like legislative strategies, and I don't know how this would compare to the example that you raised, but coalition building and like trying to work with groups within the state that like you might not necessarily agree with, and they might be pushing for things that you don't agree with, but like trying to get it softened, like trying to get the language tweaked a little bit so that it's not so bad or it's not so permanent, or anything that you can do like within the state to not just like put up a wall and fight it, but to try to like get it like slow rolled a little bit. That can be a helpful strategy. But yeah, I mean, like you said, there are some states that are just really, really tough to work in. Good luck.
Thank you. Cheryl, I have a question for you. What do you advise for summer experience? Is it better to have legal experience or animal welfare experience? And I feel like we might have touched on that a little bit, so I'm going to add an additional of any tips for what you look for in an application when you're hiring.
Yeah, so I assume that our experience at Animal Outlook is similar to a lot of other animal protection organizations. We get a ton of applications of, I love animals and I want to help. We also actually, in the law context, we actually do get a lot of strong law student applications. I don't think just a sort of passion, like put me to work, like that's not what you're here for. You're not just to sort of be a body, you know, to kind of just implement someone else's vision, right? Like my way of thinking about hiring is I am trying to find people who can both think and do. So I want somebody, I don't want somebody who's just giving me a you know, the same resume that they're giving 100 other possible employers, and they're just, you know, listing out, oh my God, the cover letter problem, you guys. The cover letter is not a summary of your resume. Like, just Google how to write a cover letter, and you will be ahead, like if you just then do that, and you will be ahead of like 95% of people out there. I'm sorry, I'm not personal to anyone in this room, but Jesus. The cover letter, like write a good cover letter. In your cover letter, talk both about why you're interested in the animal law issue and what particular skills or interests you bring to the table. And obviously that's where you highlight your law skills. I will say the number one question that I have used in interviewing, and I started when I was, you know, when I was just doing the law piece. I started this with legal interns, but now it's literally every position I ever hire, or if somebody else is involved in the hiring, I make sure that it includes this question. It's how would you solve the animal agriculture issue? People just cannot handle that question for the most part. The people who can are excellent. And it's because I don't even care what they're saying. I don't even care if I agree with them on what they're saying. I want to see their thought process. And I want them to be willing to own up to any gaps in their knowledge. I want them to be able to say it to a person they think might know more about the issue than they do, and, you know, show me that they have thought this through and that they have an opinion on how we're going to solve the problem. That tends to be, if a person is excellent on that question, or if even a person is good on that question, that tends to be what separates a really strong candidate. And that's because animal law is different than other types of law. Like you could go to, you know, a law firm that does a really, you know, tax law or something and be like, I'll do whatever you want me to do. I'm really good at school. I'm great at following directions. Animal law often is a situation where, yes, you have to have all those law skills. You have to be a good researcher. You have to be a good writer. But oftentimes I'll get people who come back and say, well, you asked me this question. There's nothing on this. And I'm like, I know. I would have just looked it up if there was something on it, like I would have found it, right? You have to now think, how are you going to build an argument and make predictions and make recommendations based on an imperfect kind of, you know, set of knowledge, right? So I want people who can come in and think, and I want people who have thought through why them, like what is it about their interests and skill set that, you know, are doing that. And I think, I mean, honestly, just the cover letter thing will get you most of the way there. But I think being able to go that further direction and say, if I had, someone waved a magic wand and I had a bunch of resources, what would I do with them? How would I solve this problem? That's huge.
Great, thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll just add on and say, when I hire people at our organization, I always look, or I always ask, value addition. The fact that you've applied and you want to be part of our team, what value are you going to add? I'm assuming you've researched, you've followed our work, and you've heard in the streets how bad we are doing or how well we are doing. So what value are you going to add to our team? What did you hear about our organization that you feel we need to improve on? And how are you proposing we improve on that? That's one thing. And also the second thing is strategic advantage. We are all here at the conference, but if we're to apply for jobs, there's something about me. I'll be like, I came 32 hours from Zimbabwe, pick me. Because I know certain things, I know about Africa that most of the Americans don't know. So we are all trying to look for opportunities at the same places. And we're all graduating with the same degree programs. But somebody would have done, you know, those free online courses. Somebody would have volunteered. Somebody would have, you know, there's certain unique things about you that, about me that she doesn't have, that she has that I don't have. So it's that strategic advantage that I always look for, and also value addition to an organization.
I love that, Ever. And I think it might be uncomfortable sometimes for us to promote ourselves, right? But I think we should start to feel comfortable celebrating what makes us great, what value we add. I think that's a great takeaway from that. Thank you.
Priscilla, can
Yeah.
I just add something? Because I think the value add portion of this is extremely important. I think all of us in this room probably care about animals. Is that right? Can we get a raise of hands if you care about animals? Okay, I see some hands that aren't raised over there. I'm going to talk to y'all later. We all care about animals. And I think there's this desire for all of us to work in the movement. There's this this would be aligned with my identity, with my values. I want to work in the movement. And I think that that is wonderful, but I think it may be not capturing the whole point. What we want is for any animal lawyer working for an organization in these limited spots to be the best animal lawyer that the movement can possibly have. And if you're applying for a job, do your best, try to get that position, and trust that the HR process is going to hire the best person. So I'm not dissuading you from applying from these positions. But what I will say is that there's a huge opportunity outside of the animal law movement to contribute to the animal world. And in fact, you may have a bigger impact. You may have a much bigger impact outside of the animal movement. And the reason for that is because for you to have what I would call counterfactual impact, in other words, an impact that only exists because you exist, for you to have that impact, a counterfactual impact, you would have to be, if you work in the animal space, better than the next best person. Whereas if you're working outside of the animal space, you just have to have your values in that position for you to have a much higher counterfactual impact. Because if it weren't for you and your values, the person filling that role wouldn't have your values. So what does that mean? That means, let's say you're working for a big law firm. Now, a lot of big law firm people, they do pro bono work. Now, what kind of pro bono work do you do? Well, often that may be up to you. And so you get to decide, okay, I'm going to dedicate my time for my pro bono work to the animal world. Let's say you work for an agency like the EPA. Well, we all know the environmental destruction that animal agriculture has imposed on the planet, but not everyone does. And so just the fact that you have those values and that insight and that knowledge in that role, whatever that role may be in the EPA, allows you to contribute to the movement. So you're sort of expanding the movement by not taking up a position within the movement.
Yeah, and one thing that I'll add to that, and I think this is related to what a few folks were saying before, is know the job that you're applying for like very, very well. Because there were a lot of applications that I would get in that were like, I would talk to the person, and lobbying is, you know, in and of itself about talking to people, relating to people. Like there are a lot of different types of lobbyists and you can do it a lot of different ways, but like at the end of the day, you are going to have to talk to people a lot. And if that's not something that you want to be spending at least 60% of your time on, then like maybe that's not the right place. Maybe there are other places that you can focus your energy that are still related to policy that just aren't that direct like line of work. So do a lot of research about like what the job entails, like what the organization is about, what the law firm is about, like what other work they do in this space, what their like work culture is, like if that's something that's going to be aligned with your future goals, like where you work now is going to impact where you work later. So if you go work for a Freedom Caucus member, like you're not going to go work for a Democrat after that, right? Or if you work at like certain NGOs, like that might foreclose opportunities in other places and vice versa. So like it really depends on like your overall vision and goal for your career. So know where you're going and know the role really well before you go into an interview.
Thank you. And I will say, I'm a big fan of informative interviews. So, you know, it never hurts to email and ask, you know, can I talk with you? Can I ask you some questions about what it's like to work in your role? I'm really interested. And you never know who might email back and set up a quick, you know, Zoom chat or coffee date or something like that. So definitely, again, just put yourself out there, and those cold emails can go a long way, especially if there's a certain person who's doing exactly what you want to do, or an organization that you just feel like is your best fit, right? Thank you all so much. And we have a question.
Hi, everyone. My name is Valeria. I am doing the MSL program here at Lewis and Clark. And well, thank you everyone for sharing your valuable insights. I heard you, Manny, the first time you said this notion, well, you talked about this notion of counterfactual impact in another webinar also hosted by Lewis and Clark like 2 weeks ago. And that really resonated with me. I remember you brought up some examples about like people working in McDonald's or another like big ag firm could have a big impact. So thank you for that. And my question is for Ever. You said how being the first animal lawyer back in Zimbabwe was something that gave you an advantage to some extent. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a bit more about like the challenges that you also had to go through, the hurdles of going back to a country where the field is underdeveloped or just developing, and how you overcame them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So being the first lawyer who did animal law from Southern Africa in the world, I enjoyed saying that. But it is now outdated because I think we've got 10 Zimbabweans and You know, we are now so many, but it was, you know, the first mover advantage where you're able to sell the idea. At first, people didn't understand. I remember even my classmates who I went to law school with, they were actually laughing at me like, who goes to America and studies about dogs and cats? Why didn't you study something else that is valuable? Because they don't understand the value, and it's a new subject. So there was that confusion in the value of the work, and people didn't understand the work. And also people felt there was also pushback, especially for the first 5 years, where people felt like I'm just importing, you know, foreign ideas and importing things that are foreign in a country where we're talking about human rights, we're talking about basic food and shelter and water for people, not even to talk about animals. So it was there was quite resistance for the first 5 years, but people knew that I exist, to the extent that if people see, you know, something that is animal related, whether to do with the law, or maybe it's an advert or it's a call, you know, people would tag me, even people that I don't know. And, you know, like first mover advantage, where maybe there's a call, UNDP, or, you know, all these big organizations, they're looking for a lawyer to do a legislation review. Everybody, it's quite clear this is my job. Who else do you want to give? Because I'm alone, you know? It was good in that direction, but there was also jealousy, there was also confusion, there was pushback, but continuously doing the work, consistency proved what exactly I stood for, and also created space for me. And even mentoring opportunities now, it's now part of my work, because you're the first person, you've walked the path, you've done it wrongly in some other instances, and you now can look back and correct, and you can actually advise people to do better than you are doing, and also collaboration. But I think my biggest challenge was just the country trying to accept me. That was very hard, and I had to prove myself a lot, to the extent that I was working for Zimbabwean Wildlife, Parks and Wildlife Organization before I came here as a legal officer. It took me 6 years to get an MOU. I got it this year at an office where I thought that was the first office to give me an MOU to say, let's work together. I had to work 6 years to go back to the same company to get an MOU. Once I got the MOU there at one department, you know how these government organizations, I think they have meetings and they discuss to say, this one, she's from America. Let's wait, let's see what she's up to. Once I got one MOU, I now have MOU with the Justice Department, and you know, like the doors just opened up for me. So that was it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Patience, tenacity, you know, confidence in what you're doing, and just keep at it. You know, I often say, when I would first tell people I was interested in going to animal law, they would laugh at me. And now they're like, they ask me questions. They're like, oh, that's interesting. What does that mean? And that's all within like 15 years or so. So, you know, things are changing. So just be patient with others, be patient with yourself, and just stay committed. Great answer. Thank you, Ever.
Hi, my name is Vanessa Kranz. I'm a 3L at Vermont Law and Graduate School, and I just want to thank you all so much for being here today. I have two questions. One is directed at Manny. I think it's so important to have animal advocates in local, state, and federal legislatures. And I'm just kind of curious about, like, you're in an elected position, so how was campaigning? And I'm really interested in that kind of journey that you went on, because I think it's really tough and kind of scary to even think about, like, running for an elected position. And then I want to kind of ask all of you, given what Cheryl said about how she was asking tough questions of animal advocates, and kind of, where do you all see the movement going? You know, we know where it's been, but where do you see the future of animal law and the movement? Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Campaigning is it's the worst job ever, easily. I mean, I've never been like an Alaska fisher or whatever, but I think it may be the worst job ever. You're like constantly getting harassed. You are constantly getting like publicized in ways that don't suit you, or like the journalists will misquote you, or you constantly have to ask friends and family for money. You don't know if you're going to win. It's a horrible job. That being said, I think it's extremely impactful, or has the potential to be extremely impactful for this cause. And the reason for that is because of what I was mentioning earlier, that Valeria brought up as well, which is this counterfactual impact question. There are a lot of topics and issues that are really salient politically, and we all know them. We see them in political advertising every single day, like 100 times a day. And then there are issues that are potentially really impactful, like for instance, industrial animal agriculture, that gets zero time in any political ad, in any political world. And it's not that people don't care about it. It's that it just isn't, it's just not politically salient for a million different reasons. What that means is that if there are elected officials with your values in those positions, you have a huge potential for counterfactual impact. You can bring those ideas to the table. You can notice when legislation is moving through committees in ways that may harm animals, and you can try to stop that legislation. You can try to propose legislation that is positive, not just for animals, but for workers, for environmental justice communities, for public health, et cetera. All the things that so many of us have mentioned are intersected with all these animal issues. And so there's a huge potential for counterfactual impact, but I will admit that it is the worst job ever.
And do we have any first takers for the second question?
Yeah, I can start on the
Perfect,
future,
thank you.
because I think my opinion about this has changed over time. Obviously, starting in like the federal space and working in DC and like being involved in lobbying and direct like legislative efforts. And I think there is absolutely a place for that. I think that it's super important and that people should be working on it. But to me, I think that the biggest opportunity is in the private sector and on the industry side. It's an area that I think has been like not necessarily ignored, but resisted against for a very long time. And there are very good reasons for that, understandably. But I think the reality of the system that we're in right now, and like we can try to break the system, I'm all about it, but the reality of the system that we're in right now is that if some industry groups are even neutralized on some things, then you can make huge strides in the animal space. And there are a lot of different ways to go about that, like that don't have to do with legislating directly, that have to do with like other legal areas, but also just an investment. Like if we think about like the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, and like how that is shifting like an entire sector, the animal agriculture industry has that same potential to make like climate shifts if we let it and if we can get enough support behind it. And I know that it's a difficult thing to think through just because of the way that the system has been set up in opposition for so long. But I think there are real opportunities there, and that's where personally I would look.
So I'm gonna go a little bit broader with and maybe a little more inside baseball kind of with my answer. I think the animal protection movement, if you think of animal law as a subset of it, there's this two-edged sword of it becoming bigger and more diverse in the reasons people came to it, the way people think about it, different kind of ideological frameworks, different tactics, different arguments for what tactics should be. And law has kind of gotten lost in that. Within the general movement, people don't have a lot of literacy about the function of law. They may know what policy and kind of legislation is, but they often, I mean, literally there are times when I have to back up and be like, okay, there's 3 branches of government, like kind of start there. And honestly, not understanding litigation or the concept of impact litigation or the tradition that that's all part of, that is relatively new for the general animal movement. When I was coming out of law school, that was not the case. Law kind of had the movement. And I don't just mean there were lawyers in the movement. I think what I'm saying when I'm thinking about that is the question of legal thinking at the agenda setting table, right? And I think we need to have that ideation. We need to be able to make sure that we're playing that role. Obviously, it's not the only kind of thinking that's useful, but I think there is value to it. But I would caution people against some of the just like shrugging that you'll come up against when you walk outside of some of these law environments and into the general animal protection movement. You'll get either, some people get it immediately and they're like, this is super cool. And some people are like, yeah, but isn't it expensive and long and, you're just going to get reversed anyway. So they actually have an opinion. And some people just no idea. They don't even really know what to say. What I will say is don't get discouraged by that, because literally every time I play a little game just to amuse myself, where when I tell a random person, let's say I meet another mom at the park or something, where, comes up, what do you do for a living? To a person, everyone is like, that is so cool. Like, that is amazing. Wow. Like, and this game that I play is I increase like the level of kind of radical language that I use when I describe what I do. And I'm like, how insane can I sound? Before people stop being like, that's so cool. I wish I had your job. I have not found that limit yet. People still think it's really cool. And I think, I was sort of joking and sort of not joking at last year's AVA conference about how much like, but kind of attitude we were getting inside the conference. And I'm like, well, if I just sort of walk outside and find someone on the street and tell them what we're up to, they're going to be really excited. So don't get discouraged. That is a thing. I think it is our job to bring legal thinking kind of back into the mix in a way that's really robust and teaches non-lawyers the value of it as well, and can kind of learn from non-lawyers in terms of the way they think and what they're bringing to the table as well. So it's all part of, a tapestry. We want to make sure that it stays in there. And then the other thing I'll say is if you think about animal laws inside that movement, it also sits outside the movement. There are plenty of people doing animal law at private law firms or as their own practice. And I think some of that is out of necessity because, there's very few jobs at in the nonprofit world and they don't pay a lot and et cetera. But some of it is because that's where the biggest impact can be made, and kind of what you're hearing from these other speakers, I definitely agree. And then I would just go slightly kind of click over from that and say it's also about finding new ways to do law that you would not necessarily think on their face is about animals, right? So maybe you're a person who can get extremely good at class action plaintiffs litigation for false advertising or unfair business practices or whatever, anti-competitive type stuff. And you can do that for years in a firm, and then you can start applying those skills for animals. And I think too few people do that. There are people who go right out of law school and just hang out a shingle, and you can do that. And you can do it and just kind of cobble together animal law cases, or you can do it by picking an area that you think has potential. It's okay to have more division of labor in this movement, right? Like more specialization. And I think that, that is just an underutilized area. And if you're talking about where should the movement be going, I think that's a big part of it.
I'll just quickly jump in and say, animal law is growing world over. There is competition, stiff competition here in the States, but you are very much welcome. You're very much welcome in Africa, you're very much welcome in Asia, and I'm telling you, you will make an impact. You will see growth, you will enjoy it. You might not get water and electricity here and there, but in terms of when you look back, you'll be like, we didn't have this, now we have this. So, and with the whole LLM growing, there's room to partner. So find a country, find a continent you're interested in. There's no space here. Look for me, look for us. We can work and make a difference because there's so many things, because here you are leaders. you're exposed, you've seen so many things, we can partner and come up with something that is much better and impactful back home. So I see the movement spreading and growing much more, collaborating, the LLMs and the undergrads collaborating and bringing a difference and bringing something new, and even changing the course and the context of animal law, because right now we're still moving with the animal law as defined here in the States. But I'm telling you, if you come to Africa and how I interpret and teach animal law, there's a difference, although we are doing the same thing. So that's how I would say it.
Beautiful.
I'll just chime in really quickly. I think I see the movement moving more towards institutional action as opposed to individual changes. I think I sort of came into this movement in a world in which it was still really popular to do vegan flyering. And I'm not sure if that still happens. It probably does still happen, but I see a lot more of the movement's thinking and resources going to institutional action. And I think that's because there has been a lot of great pilot programs that have demonstrated the immense power of that. So just to give you an example, I'll bring up Prop 12. Prop 12 passed in 2016. When it passed, California, only 6% of eggs in California were from cage-free hens. That means about 6% of consumers were choosing cage-free hens. But when they were presented with it on the ballot, 63% of them said that they wanted all California eggs to be cage-free. So there's this difference between the consumer mindset and the citizen mindset, or the corporate executive mindset. And so if we can tackle those leverage points and take advantage of them for the benefit of animals, I think we should, because I think the benefit is 10, 100, 1,000-fold of impact compared to the sort of individualized action that I think we've been known for a long time.
My name's Brooke. I'm from Villanova, like over near Philadelphia. We're still a pretty small new chapter. I'm here with my Vice President Jorge Navarro. And I guess I kind of heard you all kind of touch on it already. Some people think this is an amazing effort. Some people laughed at you. I'm really sorry to hear about that. So I guess my question is just, how do you go about inspiring, if not like blatantly persuading non-advocates that animal welfare is a worthwhile cause?
I can start with that one. There are surveys you can pull and anecdotally experience as well. No matter how you examine this issue, no matter how you split up people, right, where you're from, age, race, political orientation, gender, whatever, however you want to slice up groups of people, across the board, about 97% of people oppose animal cruelty. If you can, the problem is that you're not trying to make a values argument. You're not trying to convince people that it's bad to be cruel to animals. What we don't have is the cultural norms of behavior that go along with that, right? And in order to kind of advance that, law is a big part of that sort of machine. But to inspire people and understand them, you start by connecting with them. You start by connecting with them on that basic values. That gets you most of the way there. And then, these additional questions often come down to what the social science says, that it comes down to a lack of self-efficacy, meaning you cannot really accept, if anyone has sort of had this experience where, you show them something horrible that's happening to animals or an investigation video or something, they're like, don't show me that or it's going to make me want to go vegetarian. And you're like, well, this is why. It's because people cannot sort of accept the information if they do not have the self-efficacy, which means they have to believe that they themselves can do the thing, whether that's, individual or political action or being an activist or whatever, right? Doing the career, right, in this kind of context. And that doing that thing will go, a step forward in solving the problem. So the problem is not that, we are certainly not the outliers from a values point of view. We have to bring the vision based on the values, trigger that in people, understanding that, we share those values, right? Because it's already there. And we have to bring that vision and that, like, it's a pep talk. Like, I always think of like sort of Rosie the Riveter when I'm thinking about this, right? Like, we can do this together. It's a movement. And you're building on something that already is a super strong foundation. It's just about moving those norms forward.
Yeah, I would say so. I'm from Kentucky originally, and I grew up in like Eastern Kentucky. So animal welfare was pretty far from the minds of a lot of people that were there. Like I have a lot of farmer friends, like Department of Ag folks, and Kentucky is obviously like one of the worst states for animal welfare. But when you but when you talk to people there about like people will ask me like, why are you vegetarian, or why are you vegan, or why are you doing these things, or why are you avoiding this? And like, if you come from a place of like diffusion and curiosity, as opposed to telling someone that they're doing something wrong, or telling someone that their entire way of life, like the entire way that they've grown up, like their parents' way of lives, like telling them that that's wrong, but like just offering a different perspective and a new way to see things. I think that that's really, really important. And like, Rome wasn't built in a day, you know, like little tiny incremental understandings are really, really impactful. And we've seen that in a lot of different spaces. I think like in the domesticated animal space, like there's been a lot of progress made there, like, you know, the adopt, don't chop, like people like that resonates. So it's moving, but I think it has to come from a place of like mutual understanding and compassion, like for the people that are involved in those things also, as opposed to just like the animals caught in the system.
Yeah. Brooke, thanks so much for that question. I think, like Cheryl was saying, I think folks across the board want to be kind and to take care of even animals. I think one thing that the animal movement has done that has caused us to basically shoot ourselves in the foot is that we've set up a lot of purity tests that I think have been very exclusionary to people. And so the biggest one is like, are you vegan? Right? It's this question that there's this like saying in the animal movement, which is like, you can't love animals and eat them. And that's just not true in some sense, because people have a multitude of different interests and beliefs, and they are complex, and they hold them all at once. And we are social animals. And breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we are faced with another social animal that's putting all sorts of pressure on us, a culture that's putting all sorts of pressure on us. And ultimately, very, very few people are vegan, but that doesn't mean that they don't think that it's important to care about cruelty at the same time. And so what I think to this question about how do you make people care about animal welfare, the answer is I think they already do. The question is, what's a call to action that allows them to feel like they're part of a movement? And I think one thing that we can encourage folks to do is to consider our movement a very big tent and allow them to contribute to the movement without these purity tests that go against our social nature. And so some examples are donating. I would much rather people donate $300 a year to an organization like Animal Outlook than for them to go vegan and never talk about it, or never talk about the importance of the animal factories and things like that. I think that's much more impactful, actually. So that's one. They can go to protests. They can go to meetups. They can write to their local legislators and tell them that this is an important issue. I think there's a lot of calls to action that allow people to enter the movement, express that identity around caring for animal welfare that don't have to do with this purity test around, let's say in this case, veganism.
That will move them more toward it anyway.
And will naturally move
Yeah.
it more towards that anyways, yeah.
I'll just add on and say, where I come from and how I have lived my career is I chose not to intentionally inspire people, make them vegan because I knew it would not work. But I've tried to live a certain lifestyle that advertises the value of the work that I do. For example, the classmates who were laughing at me, everybody wants to go to Harvard. I've been to Harvard because of animal law. I'm in America because of animal law. So when they see your lifestyle, like in Africa, it's about lifestyle. When they see the car I drive, when they see, oh, I've gone to London, I've met Prince William because of animals. Yeah, this is not a joke, this is true. I went to London, met Prince William, and because of animals. And then afterwards, I watch a soccer game, Arsenal versus, it's not about the animals, but it prompts them to think, how is she able to see the prince? How is she able to go to Harvard? Because it's everyone's dream to be to Harvard. Even if I went there for 1 minute, but it's those things that make people see your lifestyle, see what you're doing, and then they start to consider. That's why we have so many Zimbabwean LLMs and whatnot. I didn't convince anyone, but they see something that we do. They see the work, they see the success, they see the excitement, and slowly they get convinced. Even at family level, you don't need to, offend people, especially like in my culture, and say, no, I'm vegan, I don't eat this, I don't whatever. You can cook good food that people will just be like, can I taste that? Without even telling them you're vegan, people can just automatically want to eat the vegan or the vegan food. So it's sometimes not about talking, it's about style and preaching in style. Thank you.
My name is Alexis Gonzalez. I am a 3L at DePaul University in Chicago, and I'm the president of CALCI, which stands for the Chicago Animal Law Student Initiative. And my question for you is sort of an offshoot of the previous great question that we had. How about within the movement? How do you inspire people who acknowledge and want to work towards protecting animals, but maybe they experience a minor setback or something and they get discouraged? And where do you continue to draw your inspiration from?
I can just continue from where I left. I'll just continue from where I left. So I think discouragement is one of the key or one of the main ingredients, or maybe legally speaking, one of the essential elements of animal law. I'm sure most of the people have been discouraged one way or the other with its comments, whether it's the results of the work, and discouragement is part of the work. But I think what is important is understanding that there's so many animal law issues in this world, and you cannot solve all of them alone. Just being able to do your small bit and doing it well is way much important than trying to do so much and feeling overwhelmed and not achieving anything and stuff like that. So just say that discouragement is normal, but what is important is to just continue doing what you're doing. And that small piece of work that you do, cumulatively, what she does, what we all do cumulatively, it's something that is big. But had I wanted to do what they all do, I would be discouraged because I'm not good in certain aspects, but I'm good in my own area.
Yeah, it's a giant problem, right? I mean, it's never going to feel like the work is done. I think a couple things we could do better as a movement. One is we don't celebrate wins in a way that we could be doing. There's a lot of, kind of division and debate and critique, and all that's fine. But when something happens that felt impossible, like the Prop 12 Supreme Court win, right? Like you don't want there to be just kind of like, people shuffling out of the room and shrugging about it, right? Maybe a couple people with strong opinions and everybody kind of walk away. So celebrate those wins. You have to be careful about victories that are just kind of drummed up as victories for, fundraising reasons or whatever. But really that feeling of like, that's, how you close the chapter. It feels exciting and it contrasts from where you started with, wow, this system is so screwed up. We're never going to make any change. And it's like, look at how far we've come. Like we could do more of that. We could create more of kind of a mythology around the animal movement and animal law's role in it, and, celebrate those victories as part of those kind of story arcs. I also think working on the thing, like we heard from Ever, is the way to maintain motivation. Like, just because you lose, let's say you lose, a case or whatever, it doesn't mean that's the end of the story, right? You can do more with that issue. You can sort of fail forward. There's always a storytelling, opportunity, right? That a loss, sometimes it's like, okay, well, nobody cares about this weird aspect of administrative law. That's not the story, but the story, there is a story there. And it's a question of zooming out and being able to tell that story and go out and say, this is a true injustice. What do we do next? Let's rally people around this issue. But I think for the most part, I think that feeling of it's all too big and it's all too hard comes from not actually having selected the thing that you feel, back to self-efficacy, right? That you feel like will change things for the better. Like even like I'll just use this as the last thing I'll say about this question as an example here. Like I spend a lot of time watching investigation footage over the years. And people often will say, well, how do you do that? It's so hard to watch it. And I'm like, I know that it's happening everywhere. The fact that I'll see something or hear from an investigator they got something on tape and I'll be like, great, is weird, right? Like that is a weird thing to say when you're like, this is this insane, crazy, horrible thing that happened to an animal. But to me, it's like, that's our opportunity. That's our stuff. Like we're going to use this. And of course, it's happening everywhere, not being documented and no one's ever being held accountable for it. And, tons and tons of situations all across the country. So I have no problem sitting there going through footage and being extremely detailed and being, really getting into it. But sometimes I'll see another organization's footage and be like really grumpy about it, right? Like there was an investigation that came out of another organization. It was pretty violent calf ranch investigation. They were crushing their skulls with sledgehammers and stuff. My dad happened to call me. It's like 9 a.m. He's like, how are you doing? What's your day like? And I'm like, well, and I just, launched into this whole thing about this investigation. And then, I was like, I don't know what kind of psychopath can watch this stuff and then go out and buy milk the next day. And he's like, well, you're all mind over matter and, that you're just different from other people. And I was like, all right, let me rephrase. How can you hear what I just said and decide you want to go out and buy dairy? And it was just this total, like, he just caught me in the wrong moment. It was kind of an unhinged response to how is your day going? And then by like 10 a.m., the group called me to ask me something strategic about the investigation. And it was just evaporated. It was gone. I was like, all right, I'm in it. Like, we're going to do something about this. So there's always something you can be doing, even if, the obvious, like we tried this and failed, doesn't work, or even if it's something you hear about and you just, aren't working at. There's always something you can be kind of focusing your attention on and say, look, like, this is what I am going to make a difference about.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think the tendency towards burnout or fatalistic thinking in the movement stems from, I'd say, two things. One is an unrealistic optimism. There's this like, God, everything is going horrible. It should have been fixed by now. There's this like, I think we have timelines that are really short in our minds around what a movement should be able to do, especially when there's such clear injustices happening. We sort of have an expectation around the moral arc of the universe bending in ways that we think are much faster. I think maybe we should expand our timelines for when our movements will be able to reach certain milestones, and we should see ourselves as part of the beginning portions of a movement that's going to be lasting for many, 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 many decades, and potentially an entire century from now, and dedicate our lives in that way. I think the other piece of this is that we have a tendency to look at outcomes as opposed to seeing ourselves working with a process. So if I can recommend one book on this topic, it's A Guide to the Good Life by William Irvine, and it's about Stoicism, but it really touches on how we should be focusing more on the process as opposed to the outcome of our actions, and how that is sort of a key to living in a much more sustainable, happy way. And I think this ties into this point that I've been making around counterfactual impact. I think one of the most powerful positions that you can have for the animal movement is working as the CEO of Tyson. If you were the CEO of Tyson, the world would be a much, much, much better place. Even though you, as a CEO, people can point to you and say that you are responsible for billions of animals being tortured. But presumably, if you were in that role, you'd be able to shift things towards a better direction. So even though the outcome is bad, because you engaged in the process, that outcome is less bad than it otherwise would be. And so think of yourself as taking shots on goal, engaging in the work, and focusing on how is the world different because I'm in it, and how am I contributing to the world, as opposed to just looking at the outcome, because often the outcome is going to be really negative.
Yeah, I'll just add, like, similarly to the moral purity test that Manny was talking about for like the broader community, I think that there's a moral purity test that can plague the animal protection movement like from within also. And I hope that that is starting to go away, like competition between organizations and like people choosing sides and things like that. And I don't think that that happens when you're at the student level, when you're working in different like SALDF chapters. So one recommendation that I would say is like carry that ethos of like working together, big tent, into whatever amazing role that you're going to go into next, whether it's at an animal organization or not. But I think that that understanding or like that competition versus community mindset is starting to change and evolve, but like that's going to come from you all going out into the world and like making that change. So I think that's really, really important. I think that that will help with burnout a ton because instead of seeing like siloed little sectors, like you will see like a big picture community trying to work towards like shared values and common goals with like the collective understanding that transitions are okay. Like if you need a break from doing one type of work, like if you work in a shelter and you need a break from that, like you can go do something else and like that's okay. Your community is still going to be there. And like Manny was talking about, like you can still make real impact like that. So I think having that type of perspective and support for like others in the community is really crucial.
Well, thank you all so much. We are at time.
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to meet you. My name is Beth Nacarado. I'm the Chief People Officer at ALDF. Is it okay? Can you see me from back here? Yeah, good? Okay, thank you. Just mindful that you kind of maybe want to see my face. I have some special guests up on stage with me. I have Priscilla, who you already know, and Alyssa, who you already know. They're my colleagues at ALDF. And I have Professor Russ Mead, who some of you who go to Lewis and Clark might know. And we met for the first time last night, and we did this thing called networking. And now he's going to help me with my presentation. And we'll go through the presentation to tell you why that's such a magical and important thing. So thank you all for being here. What is networking? It's a pretty simple concept, actually. It's just building relationships. We do it all the time. We do it in all parts of our lives. We do it with friends. We do it with family members. We do it with everybody that we meet basically every single day. And some people really, really love that. And for some people, it makes them just a little bit uncomfortable. But it's an important thing for us to do in our lives because it is something, oops, wrong way. It helps us grow in our careers. It helps us grow in our lives. It helps us be successful. Success, I think, looks different for particularly people in this group, and I think it looks the way that I would agree it looks, which is making an impact in our world, right? It's hard to make an impact if you don't ever talk to anyone or do anything, because we all need other people to help us do the things that we like to do. It meets a basic need for us, and it helps us make the impact we're all really here to make together. Where do we do this? We do it everywhere. You should do it everywhere. You should do it in every aspect of your life. Networking isn't something to be done just in a professional setting. You can do it at the gym if you're a person who loves to go to the gym. You can do it at a volunteering opportunity. If you have people that you volunteer your time with, they probably share something in common with you. You can do it anywhere. And it's really important to not just focus on professional things because you're going to narrow your scope of networking. Meeting people and making those connections with people are things that help you move through life in the most productive way. And I think networking is how a lot of people here maybe have gotten here. And I think we might have a few people who could share some stories about how networking helped them get here. Alyssa, I think, has a wonderful story to share.
Yes. So I think my big thing is you never know where life is going to take you. So network like it. In 2019, I was a law student here at Lewis and Clark in Portland, Oregon, and I was at the Animal Law Conference, which was here, and I met Chris Green, who was the executive director at Harvard, and he introduced me to B. Friedlander, who was an attorney in Michigan, and I just 5 short years later, now Chris Green is my boss, and I go to dinner with B, and she has introduced me to this big Michigan animal law community. And I can assure you, in 2019, Chris Green being at ALDF and me living in Michigan were not on my bingo card. So you just have no idea where life is going to take you, and those connections are really helpful. So I think that that is like a big one that I would recommend.
Such a good one. Mine is networking with my peers. So when I was a 1L at Lewis and Clark, there was a magnificent 3L who was just like everything I wanted to be, right? Her name was Meg York, and she was just so cool and so helpful. And I just chatted with her as much as I could. And it turned out that when I was applying to my 1L, summer experiences, Mercy for Animals had their interview open, but it was for 2L and 3Ls. And so I was like, I'm not going to apply, I'm not qualified, I'm not going to bother. And Meg really encouraged me to take that leap and try to apply. And she put in a good word for me, and I ended up getting that position, and it really opened me up to a lot of other networking opportunities, meeting other people, spending time in West Hollywood, engaging in undercover investigation work and things like that right out of 1L. So that was a student I met who, again, I just had personable conversations. We talked about our animals and food we like and movies we like, right? But it was building that rapport, and she saw that I had something in me that made her think that I could apply to that and get it, and it worked out. So students as well, you never know where people might end up.
That's definitely something we're going to talk about, is to not forget the people who you are just in line with. You don't always network up, you network around you too. Does anybody else have a networking story to share? I know that Professor Mead did a session like this for the students at Lewis and Clark. Has anybody gotten to practice the things that he taught you so far that you want to share? Anybody want to be brave?
Well,
kinda
I'll
early.
just jump in and say that the people that you know, if you're going to do animal rights, animal advocacy work is far more important than what you know about this topic. And so to the classes I was teaching, I was describing that this is the perfect opportunity. This conference is unique. You are not going to meet the same number of animal law activists probably anywhere else. So have a plan for this weekend. I mean, literally plan out how you're going to meet people, the kind of information you're going to collect on those people, and then how you're going to use that. Today is the day to start building that network that's going to help you. We could call it careers, but I'm going to call it, saving the lives and helping the lives of animals. So the people you meet this weekend will help you change the lives of countless animals, but you got to do your part. You got to really engage in this thing called networking.
That's exactly right. Jessica.
That I would share a story. I work at ALDF. I can't do this. As you can see, my awkwardness does not work well with traditional networking. And I am not somebody who worked well with the prescription of shoot yourself through, engage, do everything that the student services told you to do. Try to find people that you connect and re-interact. I'm just different, and it felt really uncomfortable for me. But I can say that applying to things and putting yourself into these things and doing things merit-based also gets you into the door. Sometimes it's just even easier to be honest about the fact that you don't have relationships with these people and you really are focused on the work and the jobs bring you together, and then you develop organic friendships with people. And then those friendships get you. It may be a little bit harder. It may be a little less schmoozy. But for somebody who may be shy and doesn't necessarily feel like they can own the I'm a stranger, you have to be my friend now, which isn't always the case, but that's how it felt for me. I think there's a lot to be said about just becoming friends and enjoying and loving the people that you work with. And then a lot like what Alyssa said, you don't know where you're going to end up in 5 years. And I have people on my text messages and in my contacts that will offer, ballet tickets or concert tickets because I worked with them and they knew I was in the area, or you get drinks. And then those relationships that come organically are the ones that I've been able to really rely on, and they in turn rely on me. So I think a lot of times the I'm here to network really works for a certain group of people, especially people that are outgoing or very neurotypical. But for those of us that are not, I think that you will always find your way. I think there's something to be said about putting yourself out there, but there's another thing to be said about knowing what works for you and sticking with that. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessica. That she's exactly right. She just kind of summarized a lot of what we're going to talk about today, and a lot about what is so horrible about networking. I'm sure you hear the term networking and like at least a good portion of the room goes, oh God, that just sounds awful. It's just a term that we subscribed to making connections with people. And truly, if you're going to do something like networking, if that's like your intention going into a situation, kind of think less about getting 50 different names in that moment and making fewer meaningful connections. That's always going to get you further, because making fewer meaningful connections from there will help you make more meaningful connections. People are looking for that kind of meaningful piece of things rather than something that feels just too transactional. This is kind of what I think most people think about networking. It's probably a little hard to read the cartoon, but the first chicken is asking, what do you do and what do you do for a living and how can I use you to my benefit? And the second chicken says, I'll give you vague details only so that you can't Google me and follow up with me at my office with a resume. So that is how people think networking feels. And sometimes it does feel like that. And it feels like that when you go into it with a transactional mindset rather than a relationship building mindset. Okay. So there are traditional ideas about networking. And I think if you go to sort of a more corporate one, you would learn all of these things, right? Build a contact list, have a focus on job titles and organizations, go to the person you think might be most influential in the room, have a 30-second elevator pitch prepared and be able to tell them all about yourself, and then ask them to do something for you, right? Like that's kind of our traditional idea of networking. The one thing I definitely want you to keep from that traditional idea is to build a contact list of people. Know who you are talking to, remember them, find a way to remember them. I know Professor Mead has some really good ideas about how to keep that contact list that I really liked. So when we met last night for about 2-3 minutes, we realized we had a lot in common just in that very moment. And I let him know I was doing this session today. And he said, well, this is something I do all of the time. Maybe we can talk and we can share ideas and figure out how to help each other. That's exactly what networking is. Maybe we have something in common. Maybe we can talk. Maybe we can help each other somehow. And today we are doing that. So I've asked him to contribute a little bit to the discussion today, because I loved a lot of his ideas and we've learned a lot from each other already. So if you don't mind sharing your contact list ideas, I'd love that.
All right, so on contact lists, I'm going to make it really simple. Your goal this weekend, if you want to build a contact list, is to capture the people who you speak to, capture their names and their email addresses. All right, if you're taking notes, write down their names, write down their email addresses. If you can get it, you might not be able to. And then also remember one fun fact about them, or if not a fun fact, whatever you were talking about. So the goal is not for you to sell yourself now. Your goal is to make a contact that you can follow up later. So people that do networking for a living, professional salespeople, or maybe lawyers that are out looking for clients, we all use the same thing. You establish the list, then you follow up with what the industry calls touches. But you can't reach out to somebody in 4 months unless you have their name and you remember something about them. So your goal this weekend, when you talk to somebody, remember their name, pull off to the side, pull out a piece of paper, pull out a pencil or a pen. I actually keep a small notebook in my pocket, which I won't pull out. That would be awkward. But write their name down. Sally Smith. And let's say it's not a working professional that's been in the field a long time. Maybe it's a co-student. Write down what school they went to. Get their email address if you can. If not, you'll probably be able to find it. And then write down they have 3 cats, or their undergrad is photography, or whatever. And what that allows you to do is tickle ahead. Again, there's professional software that does this, and I'm not saying you should do that, but just in your calendar, say, write to this person, schedule it 4 months out, shoot them an email after you find some interesting cat article, that's something that's happening in the cat world this week, and say, hey, I came across this. I don't know if you remember me. We had this great conversation at the Animal Law Conference. I thought I would send this along. That simple. At least 90% of the time, the person is going to respond back and say, great, thanks. And maybe that's the end of it. Or a longer conversation will take place. What do you do next? You schedule it ahead for 4 more months. After you've corresponded with somebody about 7 times, unfortunately, that's what it takes, you have a relationship with that person that's open enough for you to ask them for anything and them to ask you for anything. That is what you're trying to build, but you can't build it without that list. One just old technology thing, back before we were using computers, and I'm old enough to say that, we literally had a Rolodex, and I had a custom-made one that held 2,000 cards. I had 2,000 people sitting on my desk that I could contact at any time by physically flipping through cards. Now you don't have to do that. Now you can all put it in your contacts folder. But do that. If you're serious about this, somebody name out one of the things I'm telling you to do. Go ahead. Have at least 7 contacts. What about this weekend? What's your goal for this weekend? Go ahead. Get names. Good. Another thing. I'm only going to stick you with one thing. What's another thing? So now we've got a name. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Yes. Yes. You need to contact the person. Oh, fun fact. Yes, you need the fun fact. And that allows you to open the conversation later. And what's the last thing that's the hardest to get, but get it if you can? Go ahead. Email address. All right. Round of applause for all the people who came and help us out.
Let me ask you a question about your 2,000 person contact list. How long did it take you to build that?
Oh, that took a while. It took me about 10 years. 10 years.
Okay. One of the things that I do want you to take away from this is that networking is the long game, right? This isn't something you're going to accomplish. You've come to the ALC this year, you're going to get 1,000 names and you're going to be set, you're going to be done. This is something that you keep practicing and keep building over time. So don't forget that this is definitely the long game. Okay, so why is traditional networking ineffective? Because it asks you to just recite dry facts to people. Hi, my name is Beth. I'm the Chief People Officer at ALDF. Cool. That doesn't connect you to me in any way, shape, or form. Maybe you think it's interesting for now, but you may or may not remember that. What people always remember is how you made them feel. They remember the experience of talking to you. What was it like? Was this person someone who was interesting? Was this person someone who asked me a lot of questions about myself? I think you heard the panelists earlier say people like to talk about themselves. What actually people really love to talk about is the knowledge that they've learned and the thing that they're the most passionate about. People spend a lot of time gaining knowledge about something that they're passionate about, and they want to spread the word about it, right? It's something that they're super interested in. People will talk to you about whatever like eating program that they're on because they're really passionate about it. People talk about what they're passionate about. So whatever it is, that's the knowledge that they want to share with you. Try to figure out what that is how you can kind of get away from the dry facts, because dry facts are just dry facts, right? If you're just doing these quick, like 30-second intros and not focusing on picking someone to make a more meaningful connection within that time, it's just going to not be long enough to leave an impression, right? You've got 30 seconds with someone, you're in, you're out, you're done. It's just a transaction, right? And it keeps your network really narrow if you're only making these kind of superficial connections with people as opposed to building an actual relationship with someone, because actual relationships are reciprocal knowledge sharing and reciprocal helping. And that's something that you continue to do over time, right? It doesn't happen in just 30 seconds. It also would narrow how people think of you. If all you're doing is kind of reciting the professional things about you, they've not learned a thing about the dynamic human that you are, because every single person in this room is a dynamic human. We all have this amazing connection with each other because we're passionate about animal advocacy, but we also do super cool things on the side, right? We also do super cool things that we're very interested in, that we're very passionate about in our lives. Somebody maybe here is like really into crocheting. Please teach me. I'd like to learn. There's just different things that we have that make us whole humans that we feel strongly about, and you can't learn that from somebody in a 30-second dry pitch. Okay. So again, why it helps to focus on these deeper relationships, you make a longer connection with someone. It's really a magical thing when all of a sudden you hear from somebody you made a connection with months later or sometimes even years later. The best feeling in the world is for someone to send you an email saying, hey, I don't know if you remember me, but we met at last year's ALC and you told me about this thing and I did it. And I just want you to know it really helped me. To be the person receiving that is like, it's just a magical feeling. Your heart just grows when you hear that you've actually made a difference in somebody's life. So the piece I want you to remember from that is that don't forget that you're not just seeking things, you're also seeking to give things to people when you're networking with someone, because that also helps you when you're moving through life, for someone to remember this person was really kind, really reliable, and they taught me something. They're going to then tell other people about how kind, reliable, and educational you were for them. It gives people an opportunity to build trust in you. Every relationship is built on trust, right? That's exactly how we build relationships with animals, right? Animals don't have a relationship with us unless they trust us. It takes time sometimes to do that with them, but it's the same thing with humans, right? We just have to build trust in relationships. And it gives you an opportunity to demonstrate what you bring to the table. I mean, we are in a phase where we all have something that we're learning, but you all have something that you definitely bring to the table too. So don't forget that you have that. And I think, as Priscilla mentioned, don't forget to network with the people who are in this room. You have no idea where the person sitting next to you is going to end up in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, right? And whether you'll end up at the same table, in the same room again, in a different capacity. So keeping those connections strong is really important, and they'll last you forever. All right. Yes, ma'am.
So this is somewhat personal, and maybe a lot of you don't experience this, but even if there's one person who does in the room, I'd like to share. When I was a 1L, starting out and everything, I was extroverted in the sense of talking about animal law. I could do that. I could go up to anyone and talk about that. It was easy for me, but I was really shy and unsure of myself, not that confident in talking about who I was, putting myself out there, my hobbies, my interests, my personality, letting myself shine as I would if I was with a friend. When I was around professors, it was always just very like straight-laced and don't want to do anything to draw attention. I don't want to share anything. But that honestly is how I realized so many other students were building these relationships and what was missing with mine. So in 2L year, I came back and I was like, okay, I'm going to start putting myself out there. I'm going to start sharing stuff about myself, my hobbies, my interests, my beliefs, my past experiences, whatever it might be. And it was in doing that where I really noticed a change, but it took me a lot of practice to be able to do that, to be able to think that I was honestly worthy of this person's time, that they were interested in getting to know me, that they were not just waiting for me to stop talking, right? And believe that we all here want to get to know you. You all are so fascinating, so interesting. And I think just being able to promote who you are and stand behind that can be really powerful. And it was Russ's class, actually, I'll give a shout out to him. I took his nonprofit class and We talked about art, we bonded over art, and he would bring fruit every day. And I told him, Honeycrisp apples were my favorite. And so he would always bring me Honeycrisp apples. And yeah, Russ was really, truly the first person in law school I felt in that professional sense that I could really open up to and talk about. And we're now really good friends. So I just wanted to share that if you're out there and you're like, man, I have my elevator pitch for anything professional but personal, I'm not sure what to say. Know you're not alone, but also know you're really interesting.
I'm glad you shared that. Can you, I'll just ask you a question. As you were starting to take this new approach to networking with people, did it help to keep doing it?
Absolutely. It's so frustrating when they say like practice, 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 but even public speaking, I mean, you just have to get up on the stage and do it. No amount of talking about it will prepare you quite like actually just doing it. So it was really, really uncomfortable the first time, sharing about what my cat did or what I had for like what I'm going to make for dinner or anything like that. It was just very apprehensive, but the more I did it and the more I was responded with really genuine, kind people, it's like, oh, you guys aren't scary. You're not, some superhero, right? You're just a human doing human stuff, liking human things. So that helped a lot, but practice, oh my goodness.
Practice. The other thing I really liked about your story is that you still remember to this day that one of the things that Professor Mead did that made you feel comfortable was remember that you like Honeycrisp apples and bring those. So that kind of goes back to the fun fact you were talking about, but it's just the thing, okay, this is something we can connect about, right? Finding anything to connect about, including apples, is key, right? It can be fruit, doesn't matter.
And I will just add, I'm so glad Priscilla brought that up because you have no idea how excited I would be to talk about the Real Housewives franchises. So like, you just never know. I mean, granted, like test the room before you like jump into that one, but we are human. We are excited. I want to hear all the things that you're doing for your student chapters and all of that as well. But I also would love to talk to you about any other thing because that's what I do when I log off work and I'm done sending you all massive emails is binge watch TV. So yeah, we're just human too.
Exactly. Exactly. All of these things are true. So, the part of the thing that helps with this is learning how to help each other. When you are working on a problem together, that is like a tremendous bonding experience, right? So if I were in a situation where suddenly I had 20 bunnies that I needed to make sure got a home, what would I do if I'm not a bunny expert? I would call somebody I know who's a bunny expert and say, can you please help me? And the two of us will troubleshoot that problem together, right? I'll learn something from that person about helping bunnies, and maybe they'll learn something from me too. And we can kind of work through it a little bit together, which is a really incredible experience. When you solve a problem together, you create a bond. Sometimes it's a more traumatic bond than others, but if you can work through a problem together, that actually binds you to that person for life, and it increases your learning just in life and as a human, it just makes things better. The best networks too, I think I kind of said this earlier, aren't always the ones with the most influence, but where you can make the most influence. When you have had an opportunity to help someone, people remember that, and that helping that you've given them makes them want to tell other people about how helpful you are. So don't always think that you have to network with just the professors, as Priscilla was saying earlier, network with everybody that you can. It's going to give you a reputation, and you want the good one. Okay, so I'm going to give you kind of a little bit of a framework to think about this. There's an organizational psychologist I really love. His name's Adam Grant. This is something I could talk endlessly about. So if you are a psychology nerd and you want to hang out and talk about that, come see me. We can just talk for hours and hours and hours. But one of the ways that he talks about people in the workplace is as givers, takers, and matchers. And there are people who look to the world who say, what can I do for you? And those are the givers. There are people who look to the world and say, what can you do for me? And those are the takers. And then there are the people in the world who say, quid pro quo. I will do something for you if you do something for me. This is not necessarily like a judgment call, right, on anybody. It's just kind of how we approach the world sometimes. Maybe it's a learned thing. Maybe it's an inherent thing. Who knows, like that deep into the psychology I've not gotten. But the key trait here is to note that the givers are not focused on themselves. The takers and the matchers are me focused, right? What can you do for me is the focus. People always kind of figure that out right? If somebody's only focused on themselves, they can tell you're not engaged in active listening and not really like absorbing what you're saying about you. There's a lack of interest in you when you're talking to someone who's a taker. And it just means that you're not having as tight of a connection, as close of a bond that you're building. But there are positives, right? Each of these traits does definitely have its positives. So givers are generally, there's studies to back this. Again, if you want to nerd out, please come find me. The givers in an organization are generally the highest performers, and they are the people who have the most connections because they are the people that everyone goes, oh, that person's a helping person. I can come to them for something if I need it, right? So they're seeking that person out. They also inherently benefit their organizations as a whole. So if you want to make a big impact, just being a giver alone makes a big impact to the people around you to further the work that you're doing. So that's something to kind of keep in mind if you're, it's hard to think about yourself, but you can think about others. That's a way that you're giving a big impact. Takers, they feel a little bit transactional, but they usually rise pretty quickly because they're very, very good at identifying who can do something to benefit them, and then they get there really quickly. So they often get to the top, but it's not clear that they necessarily stay there, right? The matchers move up pretty quickly too, and for a little bit, that matching feels really good, like, oh, okay, we both did something for each other, and that's really nice. But you'll see in the next slide, these things don't last. Givers, the biggest drawback of a giver and the hardest thing to manage as a giver is not doing too much for other people and forgetting yourself. I think that happens a lot for a lot of people who are focused on something like animal advocacy, because generally speaking, most folks are big givers, right? We want to help, we want to do things. You can really easily get lost in that, be kind of taken advantage of, and you're doing everybody else's work all of a sudden. So just kind of be mindful of that if you're identifying yourself as a giver. Takers, they don't last either. People figure that out pretty quickly too. And oftentimes the takers are taken down by what is called like an avenging matcher, because matchers are the people who want to give back exactly what was gotten. So if you give them something negative, they're probably going to give you something negative too, right? The beauty of matchers, though, is that in an organization, matchers will follow what the bulk are. So if the bulk of people in an organization are givers, they tend to trend more giving. If the bulk of people in an organization are takers, they will trend more takers. This information, I think, is not only helpful for networking, but for you as you move into your workplaces to kind of identify the people that you're working with, maybe a little bit easier, so that you know you can set yourself up better for success moving through your own careers. Okay, so now what? We've done like a lot of talking. The things for you to do to make yourself really good at networking, one of those things is to build an area of expertise. You already have something. I know it's really hard sometimes to think about yourself, but you already have something that you're really good at. So build it up. Maybe you're excellent at building web pages. Maybe you're like super organized and you have the world's greatest label maker and can help somebody get organized. Those people are invaluable, right? Like that's a really, really incredible trait. What can you offer to somebody to share your knowledge and expertise with them? So figure out what that thing is about you and sort of keep that in your pocket for when you're meeting somebody. How can I connect something I'm good at with this person? And tell people about it. Don't just tell, people in this room, but tell your friends, tell your family, tell everybody. The number of times where somebody who's not in the animal field asks me a question to help someone else is like a million, right? You'll find that people start to look to you for information. So not only can you develop an area of expertise in animal law, but you can develop it in just the skills that you have to offer. One of the most important things is to seek knowledge from other people, not just for learning, but again, going back to that, people like to share their knowledge. So asking people to share their knowledge with you is hugely important. And leave with an eye to keeping the connection open. So I'm going to ask Professor Mead to add to that a little bit, and then Priscilla and Alyssa are going to show us how to do that.
So imagine this. It's tonight. It's the time when people have a drink in their hand, and the three of us are talking because we have these long relationships, lots of stories, and you want to break in. And you kind of stand on the periphery and you don't see a way in because we're not shutting up. And your first tendency is to walk away and figure, oh, I couldn't crack that group. I'm going to go to another one, or you go to friends you already know. So let me give you a technique that will help. Just when there's any break, go up to any one of us, extend your right hand and say your name. Hello, My name is Russ Mead. That will instantly, literally, the circle will open and then you can start your conversation. So try it. Extend your hand to the person next to you, say your name, and see what happens.
Fist bumps and elbow bumps are also totally appropriate. Wanna give it a shot? Go ahead. Even if you know the person, doesn't matter. It's just practice.
Go ahead. Okay. All right, I don't want to hijack the entire presentation here, so come back. Did you notice the rise in the conversation in the room? Look around the table. There's smiles on every single one of your faces. Remember this technique. It will get you through one of the most awkward things about networking, and that is that initial contact. And now we'll be quiet.
So now Priscilla and Alyssa are going to show us how to continue that part of networking contact and do a little networking interaction with each other.
Yeah, so I'm really hoping that we can start a student chapter Instagram page. I really want to promote it, but I'm just really started working on that.
Oh, that's such a great idea. And, I think the students could really benefit from that. And gosh, I really like Instagram. I'm kind of on there a lot. My cat has an Instagram. I would love to help with that. And maybe we can brainstorm some ways of like what we'd post and ways to get events on there. We could do polls. We could share pictures from the student chapters. I love this.
That would be so great because
Yeah.
I'm not good at Instagram. I don't know how to do a poll on Instagram. And I'm
I
not
can
very
show you.
creative. So I would love your help on that. But I do have a lot of photos of the student chapter members that I could supply.
Oh, that would be terrific because I don't have those, but I do have the Instagram skills. So we can definitely work together and hopefully build out a really cool Instagram. Hey, you should follow us on Instagram at ALDF Student Chapters.
Brought to you by our animal law program. So what did they just do there? That seemed to work really well. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. That's right. They talked about their shared interests and they connected with each other well. What else did they do? Yeah. Were they matchers or were they givers? I'd say matchers. Okay. Yeah. They could be, for sure. What else did they do? Maybe you guys didn't notice this. They turned to each other and they talked to each other, even though they were very aware there's an audience staring at them. But that body language piece is also super important. Face the person that you're with. Make eye contact as much as you can. I know sometimes that's pretty awkward, but try as much as you can. This is where the handshake piece kind of comes in. It forces you to look at that person because otherwise you're like jamming your hand into their face or their arm or something like that. You have to see where you're putting your hand, right? So making eye contact with somebody makes a huge difference. Eye contact builds an instant connection actually with people. So that's a base thing, right? Okay. So we are in a beautiful situation where we already know we have something in common with each other. So those conversation starters are really kind of the hardest piece, right? I know Professor Mead talked about like getting into the group of people, but also how do you even start with a conversation with somebody you don't know? Around here, you've got an instant in, right? What inspired you to pursue animal law? You're going to learn a lot from asking people that question in this organization and in this conference time. What are you most excited about? Again, you're going to learn a lot about a person in that moment. What is the most urgent issue you think we need to address? All of these questions are really going to start conversations. And I promise you, over the course of this weekend, you're going to find something to connect with someone with if you ask them those open-ended questions. So once you pose that question, the thing for you to do is active listen. And the most important part of active listening is A, paying attention and really hearing what the person's saying. Turning off that part in your brain that thinks, okay, what am I going to say next, right? The important part of networking is not telling somebody all about yourself. It's learning a little bit about them and then making the connection and then offering them a piece about yourself. So that listening part and that engagement part and that looking them in the eye and learning about that person is the piece that you want to start with. You can just ask somebody if they have a companion animal. Everyone loves to talk about their companion animal. You're going to spend half an hour talking about a companion animal. But I was talking to a colleague of mine who is very, very introverted, and we were talking about this experience of networking, and she shared with me that she went to a networking information session, and one of the things that she learned to say out of it was, "I'm going to network with you now," as her icebreaker, because it's awkward to network, right? Walking up to somebody and just kind of introducing yourself and saying, "I want to learn more about you," can be a little awkward. It's hard. But if you say, "I'm going to network with you," what did you guys just do? You laughed, right? It's like an instant, like, we're owning the awkwardness of the situation in this moment. It's happening, and now we can just move past it and start the conversation. So I kind of like that one as a really good one for people who it's super, super uncomfortable to do that, to just say, "Hi, my name is so-and-so, tell me more about yourself." If you just say, "I'm going to network with you now," then the person A knows exactly what's going to happen, B, they've laughed, and you've bonded. So I'd like to throw that little nugget out there for you guys to think about. So now's the time where you practice. You've definitely had coffee. You're probably going to get sleepy in a few minutes, so it's time to get up and move around the room. So I want to give you guys, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 minutes to go ahead and meet somebody new. I know you already know the people that you know here that you maybe came with from your school, but try to find somebody else. There are also people in this room who are not students who are very happy and excited to network with you. I'm looking at the ALDF table in the back. They're going to network with you too. And we'll come down and do it as well. So let's take like 5 minutes and meet somebody new. All right. Thank you, guys. There was a lot of noise, so it seems like this went well. Did you guys have a good experience meeting somebody new? Yeah? Great. I met Daria, who's over here. We had, turns out, a lot in common. She's at Vermont Law School. I have a need to go to Vermont, and so we talked a little bit about Vermont and shared some information about passion for climate change and the intersection of climate change and animal welfare. It was a really cool conversation. And Daria did something that I love, which is gave me her business card, which is her name and her contact information. It's a old school move that I'm in love with because hers is super cute. It's got a little piggy on it. Find Daria, get one of her cards because they're adorable. So that was a really good piece of this conversation for me. Does anybody want to talk about their experience? Did you use any of the things we talked about? And did it work or did it not work? Anybody? Panelists?
I know you did because I talked to a lot of you. So
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. And it felt good once you were there, right? Yeah. Very good. Anybody else have something they want to share? Yeah. Yes. Find a companion animal and go say hello to them first. It breaks all of the ice. Yeah. And you really only have to remember the animal's name. The person who's like their companion doesn't care if you remember their name, truly. Get their card though, get the animal's card for sure. You want to see them again. Okay. Does anybody have any wrapping comments you want to make before I give some pro tips before we break for lunch? No? Professor Mead?
Change your email address. Go out and register something that you can use as a domain, and then put your name in front of it and keep it for the rest of your life. And because a lot of us use these free Google accounts thinking, oh, that'll never change. Well, let me tell you about America Online. You know, that people aren't using it anymore. It used to dominate the entire space. Microsoft has closed 2 entire platforms that had email addresses. So these aren't going to last. Your school address isn't going to last. You're going to change jobs, 10 times. Go register a domain. Like my email address is russmead@russmead.com. Now, I'm not saying that you can get your own name as a domain, but find something and use it for the rest of your life. Because if it switches, people can't find you, and your 2000 contact Rolodex goes back down to start over.
Excellent tip. Okay, I just threw some last minute pro tips up there for you guys to kind of refresh. Branch out, meet people you don't know, think about networking in places that don't automatically come to mind other than a professional opportunity. Don't talk about yourself too much. Remember, ask questions and then let the other person ask questions about you. They're going to reciprocate. They're going to be interested in you too. Keep it brief. You don't have to talk for 2 hours for it to be a meaningful connection. Ask yourself, how can you help this person? What can I offer? That really goes a very long way. And then stay connected. So reach out to the person. And I can really just share with you that getting something from someone that you met 6 months ago saying, hey, that conversation we had really meant something to me and here's what I did with it, is one of the greatest feelings. And then really enjoy receiving those and thank the person who sent it to you when you do receive those. Because I promise you, this isn't all just about you looking for something. Someday you're going to be the person who gets to help. And it's an absolutely incredible feeling. So enjoy meeting each other, enjoy meeting other people during the rest of the conference. And I hope to meet all of you at some point this weekend.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to get your attention. Feel free to keep eating, but we do have some awards we want to give out. So I'm going to do that while you all are snacking on what looks like very delicious food. I can't wait to get some. Our first award today is our Stacy Gordon Sterling Scholarship Award. Stacy was the Animal Law Program Director from 2020 until she unfortunately passed away in December of 2022 from her battle with cancer. In her memory, we've created a scholarship that celebrates and honors the life and legacy of Stacy. Each year, one student who exemplifies Stacy's love for student empowerment and animal protection will be selected for this award. This year, in its inaugural year, we are thrilled to give this award to Mason Liddell, 3L, yes, at the University of Colorado Law School. Early on, Mason shared that his mission is to ensure that there's a legacy in animal law at his school, and he has worked very hard to make this happen. Colorado law, under Mason's leadership, has seen public commenting opportunities and other legislative endeavors, established pro bono hours for students by partnering with nonprofit organizations, several animal law classes, networking, fundraising, and so much more. Mason has also encouraged fellow students to lead the chapter this year, with him serving in an advisory role, which is something new, which was really great. We were excited to see. So we applaud Mason for leading by example and for his dedication to creating lasting change for animals and students alike. If Mason would like to come up.
Hi all, my name is Mason Liddell, and like Alyssa said, I am a 3L at Colorado Law. I founded Colorado Law's student chapter about 2 years ago, and I served as its president for the 2 years since then. And now, like she said too, I am a 3L advisor, a role I made up for myself because I don't think I was completely ready to let go yet. I wanted to start by saying I am, of course, honored and truly touched to be the inaugural recipient of the Stacy Gordon Sterling Scholarship. It means a lot, of course, and she was wholeheartedly dedicated to empowering students to protect animals, and she remains an inspiration to anybody trying to do the same thing today. Since reactivating this chapter, we've taken on a number of projects: student comment writing, hosting speakers, including people in this room looking at you, Manny Root now. And we've advocated for our school to more fully embrace animal law. In my mind, that last one is the most important one, probably by far. As lawyers and as law students, our job is to work within institutions. And I imagine if you're at this conference, you probably want to change those institutions at the very least a little bit. And that work can and should start at your school. One of our chapter's earliest goals when we got started was to get just one class in animal law by the time we graduated. So that would be by the time at the end of this year. And within just a few months, the school agreed to reactivate an old course in wildlife law that it hadn't offered in 5 years. And then just a couple months after that, it created a brand new course, a seminar on animal welfare, and it offered that, and it's bringing it back this next semester. And excitingly, we just recently got some sort of a green light that the school's going to bring in an experiential learning opportunity for credit for students in spring 2026 on top of keeping these other courses. Obviously, this is extremely exciting. There's been a lot of successes and there's been a lot of failures, a lot of failures. And I think it's really important to highlight that. It's important to grapple with that because really, I think so much of this work is just about flexibility and persistence. You're not going to get it right straight out the gate, and that's okay. So long as you're willing to keep pushing forward, you will find a path. Your school wants you to be involved. They want your students to be happy with what's available to them. So tell your school what you want. And if they don't listen, then you can create that opportunity yourself. You don't need anybody's permission to write a public comment. You don't need anybody's permission to give testimony on some bill concerning animals that's coming up in the state legislature. You can just do that. And then you can share this interest with other people. You can bring them in. Because we've been talking a lot up here, not everybody can or should or will become an animal lawyer. But if you bring animal law to your school, you're going to make sure that more lawyers know about the issues facing animals. And then that's going to help animals down the line when those lawyers have to think about problems involving them. That's the goal, right? To help these animals. And you start that at your school. Thank you.
I was prepared to make it through my speech without tearing up, but then Mason got me. Next up, we have our Chapter of the Year awards. These go out to two of our chapters that have really done amazing things that we're super impressed with, though we are impressed with everyone's chapter and all the applications that we get. We receive so many good ones and they make it really difficult to narrow it down to two. So we're super appreciative of everything you all do. But now for the awards, in no particular order. First up, we have Colorado Law School student chapter. This past school year, the Colorado Law chapter continued their dedication to public service, working with 3 animal advocacy legal nonprofits to create volunteer opportunities for Colorado University and Denver University law students. They also broke an attendance record with their lunch talk with Representative Manny Rutinel. This event was a kickoff for their spring legislative drafting project, where they worked on rewriting their state's endangered species laws. They also worked with organizations to support ballot initiatives and so much more. There's so much great work happening here, and we're so proud of you all. And I have the chapter up here. I'll present the award. Thank you to our Instagram mom. And then our next winner is the University of Texas Law School. Our Texas Law chapter activated last year and hit the ground running. At the beginning of the year, the Texas Law chapter had 1 board member and 4 active members. But through their efforts, by the end of the year, they had 5 board members and over 40 active chapter members. They went from hosting 0 events to 9 events last year, throughout the year, including a showing of the documentary screenings of The Last Pig and The Smell of Money, raising awareness for farming practices. Their most significant event of the year was hosting an animal law workshop consisting of students and faculty. You never know what faculty members at your school might be interested, with the Phoenix Zones Initiative, where they discussed policy implications of research involving animals. We're so proud of their dedication. And I would like, is there anyone from the University of Texas Law School here right now? No, I think they're getting here later tonight. So I will keep their award from them and I will let you all continue eating. This concludes our awards part.
We are going to be having the Law Student Scholarship Panel. It was a very competitive process in which many very talented students submitted papers, and these 3 finalists really stood out. I haphazardly introduced myself earlier, but my name is Jessica Chapman. I'm a staff attorney at ALDF. Let's get started. So our first LLM student is Olivia Ruthven, and she, like I said, is currently an animal law LLM at Lewis and Clark Law School, and she received her JD from Suffolk University in 2023. And then our next student is Mason Liddell. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes, you are.
Okay. A rising 3L at the University of Colorado Law School. He's founder and president of the law school's Animal Legal Defense Fund student chapter. And then our third presenter is Piper Blank, and she is a Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy LLM fellow at Lewis and Clark Law School. Piper graduated from the University of San Francisco School of Law in May 2024, and as the first person to graduate, congratulations, from USF's Justice for Animals Animal Law Scholars Program. I will hand it over to Olivia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Olivia Ruthven, and I'm going to talk about how an inadequate law is leaving ice bears in deep water. So a little bit about me to begin. I'm from Rhode Island originally. As Jessica said, I got my JD from Suffolk University Law School in 2023, and I'm currently an animal law LLM. The thing that has remained constant in my life is my love for polar bears. My first stuffed animal was a polar bear, and my first hanging picture in my room was this Thomas Mangelson polar bear picture from my grandma. Ever since then, all I wanted to do was save the polar bears. All my school projects as a kid were about polar bears, and in my final semester of law school, I had the opportunity to do an independent study. So of course, I chose to write my paper on polar bears, and this was the result. Here's a little roadmap for the presentation. First, I'm going to give a brief overview on climate change and its impact on polar bears, including a bit about how it's destroying the polar bear's critical habitat. Then I'll go over the purpose of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. I'll discuss what permits are, the three major problems I've identified with permits, and whether the court's hands are tied or if they're just reluctant to rule any other way. And finally, I'll end with my proposed solutions. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the United Nations body for assessing science related to climate change. In their report from last year, they said, global surface temperature has increased faster since 1970 than in any other 50-year period in the last 2,000 years. And what does an increased global temperature lead to? Melting sea ice. You can see that the amount of sea ice has fluctuated over the last 10,000 years. But if you look at this sharp decrease in the last 50 years, since 1979, the amount of sea ice lost each year is roughly the size of South Carolina, about 31,000 square miles every year. Sea ice is measured in September because that's when it's at its minimum. That's the best way for scientists to most accurately represent how much sea ice is melting year after year. In 2020, US Fish and Wildlife Service prepared a biological opinion for a proposed oil drilling project in Alaska, the Willow Project. They have to prepare this type of report when a project could have negative impacts on a protected species. And polar bears are one of the species Fish and Wildlife is responsible for, and they are protected through the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. In this opinion, Fish and Wildlife said, the greatest factor impacting the status of polar bears is loss of sea ice resulting from climate change. But why is sea ice even important for polar bears? It is the only place bears can successfully hunt their main food source, seals. As you can see in the upper left-hand photo, polar bears lie in wait for a seal to come up for air. According to the photographer who took this bear waited for over 12 hours. Seals can outswim polar bears, so the only way a polar bear can catch a seal is by surprise. Food sources on land like geese, birds' eggs, and small mammals are just not enough to sustain these bears. Male bears, who can weigh up to over 1,000 pounds, can live up to 6 months without food. And female bears in their dens tending to their cubs have to survive without food for 7 to 8 months. To live that long without food, bears need to build up enough fat stores to sustain themselves, and only seals can provide enough calories in one sitting to survive. When summer comes, the sea ice begins to break apart and melt. Most bears swim to the mainland and scavenge what they can during summer months, but most bears end up going without food altogether. As temperatures continue to rise, not only is more sea ice melting each year, but it is melting earlier in the year, and it is refreezing later, making that summer season where bears are on land without food access even longer. When the winter returns and the ice refreezes, the bears on the mainland return to the ice. But with this rising temperature, less ice is refreezing. So not only does that mean that there's less ice for polar bears to hunt on, increasing the risk of starvation, but it also puts bears at risk of exhaustion while swimming from the mainland. Again, these bears went all summer without food. Imagine not eating for 2 days and then having to go run a 5K. This longer period without sea ice is putting them at risk for drowning and starvation. So to give you an idea of the impact this is having, there are 20 global polar bear populations, and the southern Beaufort Sea polar bear population demonstrates the significant impact the melting sea ice has on those populations. In this 24-year period, from 1986 to 2010, this population dropped from 1,800 bears to 900. That was cut in half. Since the Marine Mammal Protection Act prohibits hunting of polar bears, this decline is primarily due to melting sea ice. In a case about an alleged Marine Mammal Protection Act violation, the District Court of Alaska quoted Fish and Wildlife Service, who said, "Polar bears don't have a place to go if they lose the ice." And just let that sink in for a moment. Fish and Wildlife Service said, without the ice, polar bears have nowhere to go. Now that I've shown you a little bit about how climate change is impacting polar bears, we'll move on to talk about the law that is supposed to protect them. The purpose of the Marine Mammal Protection Act is to, you guessed it, protect marine mammals. It prohibits the taking and importation of marine mammals. The act defines take to mean harass, hunt, capture, or kill, or attempt to do any of those. And yes, polar bears are marine mammals. Due to the amount of time polar bears spend in and near the water, they are categorized as marine mammals and therefore are protected by this law, supposedly. As with many laws, there are exceptions. The main one here is permits, also called incidental take regulations or authorizations. Fish and Wildlife Service can authorize permits for incidental takes of marine mammals, and these permits last for 5 years at a time. Companies who want to start operations in areas where marine mammals live, like a lot of oil and gas companies, are the ones typically applying for these permits. To authorize a permit, Fish and Wildlife Service is supposed to consider the best scientific evidence available, and if the applicant has shown, in combination with this evidence, that the predicted impact on a marine species will be negligible, then the service can approve a permit. But based on their history of approving these permits, it doesn't really seem like they've always considered the best scientific evidence. The 3 major problems I've identified about this permit authorization process are the 5-year time window, the limited geographic region, and the failure to consider the nature of the proposed activities. So I'll go a little bit deeper. Problem number 1, the 5-year window. Fish and Wildlife Service only has to consider the impact to marine mammals within the 5-year permit period. This rests on the false assumption that when the activity stops, the risk to marine mammals also stops. This fails to consider the long-lasting but directly correlated impacts of industrial activities like oil and gas exploration. Ice melts over a long period of time, but it does not make the harm to polar bears any less significant. On the left part of this image, it shows the sea ice extent at its minimum in September, on average between 1979 and 1989. The image on the right shows the sea ice at its minimum in 2023. That is a pretty clear difference. But this data is not nearly as easy to show over a 5-year period, nor does it seem as significant. And since the service doesn't have to look at potential impacts outside those 5 years, they don't. Problem number 2, the limited geographic scope. In a permit application, the specified geographical region for proposed activities has to be defined by the applicant. Fish and Wildlife will determine what the predicted harm to marine mammals will be who are in close physical proximity to those proposed activities. The problem with this, like the 5-year window, it assumes that there is no risk of harm outside the geographic region, but that's not true, especially not with activities like oil and gas drilling. Here you have the drill site in Alaska for the Willow Project, and Fish and Wildlife Service only has to account for potential harm to bears within the vicinity of this site. They look at predicted impacts of noise and vibrations, but they don't have to consider that these resources they're extracting will travel far beyond that area and make its way into civilization to be used as energy, producing carbon emissions, a driver of climate change, the biggest threat to polar bears. And finally, problem number 3, which is very much intertwined with the first 2 problems, the failure to consider the nature of the proposed activities. Nothing in the Marine Mammal Protection Act requires Fish and Wildlife to consider what type of activities are being proposed and whether they pose a long-term risk of harm to marine mammals. If you remember the quote from several slides ago about polar bears not having any place to go if they lose ice, well, that case went up to the 9th Circuit, and it involved a permit authorization for 2006 to 2011 for oil and gas activities in the Beaufort Sea. You may also remember that the polar bear population I showed you as being cut in half was the southern Beaufort Sea population. Fish and Wildlife approved a permit for incidental takes. The Center for Biological Diversity filed a lawsuit claiming they violated the Marine Mammal Protection Act. The dispute in the lower court was whether the expected impacts of oil and gas activity over the 5-year period will have a more than negligible impact on the southern Beaufort Sea population and/or will result in any long-term injury to the polar bear that may accumulate with other impacts such as climate change. The district court found that Fish and Wildlife's finding that the activities would not have a significant impact on polar bears was reasonable. They granted the defendant's motion for summary judgment and dismissed the plaintiff's claim. But the plaintiffs came back for more. Center for Biological Diversity appealed to the 9th Circuit. This court said that oil and gas activities haven't physically disturbed polar bears too much. But they also said polar bears are vulnerable to climate change. Acute threats posed by a warming climate include the loss of sea ice habitat, reduction in available prey, such as ringed seals, and increased energetic needs for traveling and swimming longer distances due to reduced ice pack. That's a very interesting observation by the court. And when I first read this, I was encouraged by the court's awareness of this problem. But then they said this: with respect to bears, the service found that past interaction has been minimal. Most industry activity is conducted on land, away from the ice flows polar bears prefer. So the court recognized that climate change poses a big risk to polar bears, but then they can't or won't connect the dots that the service already has about carbon emissions, driving climate change, causing the ice to melt, to realize that this reasoning might be flawed. Did the court ever consider that these activities might be ones that are melting the ice? This statement is kind of like if a photographer takes a picture of a zebra, zooms in on one white stripe, and claims that all zebras are white. It overlooks the big picture. The court seems to refuse to take a step back and look at that bigger picture, that industrial activities are driving climate change, which is destroying the polar bear's habitat. Even though the court seemed reluctant to make conclusions of its own, when talking about disturbance impacts from industrial activities and how noise and vibrations might affect denning female bears, they said bears may even acclimate to such noises. Courts defer to agencies because they don't typically have specialized knowledge about these areas, yet they felt comfortable making this statement. It makes you wonder if courts are unwilling to look at the big picture, if it means they have to overrule an agency. But what can courts do? According to the Administrative Procedure Act, courts can get involved after a final agency action. Like in the case I've been talking about, after Fish and Wildlife approves a take permit, the Center for Biological Diversity was able to file a lawsuit. Courts do have to defer to federal agencies unless they find that the action at issue was arbitrary and capricious. As long as the agency has considered the relevant factors and made a clear connection between the facts they found and the choice they made, a court must uphold the action. But it seems like sometimes they are too quick to defer to the agency without looking at the big and well-established picture. They could recognize that this agency is not considering the best scientific evidence available and find that their action was unreasonable, but they resist. So this leads me to believe that either courts are deferring too easily, or the law as it is written is being followed, and therefore courts have no other choice, though I'm skeptical about that. But bottom line, the law needs to be changed. The Marine Mammal Protection Act was passed in 1972, and climate change was not a big issue then. Today, it is the biggest issue for polar bears, and this law has not changed to reflect that. So this law that is supposed to be protecting the polar bears does not. So we finally made our way to some possible solutions. The first is to amend the Marine Mammal Protection Act provision regarding the time period, one of two ways. Either that a specific duration should not be included, so remove it altogether, when the nature of proposed activities are known to have long-lasting effects, or increase the time period to 50 years to be able to predict approximately how much sea ice will melt. The amount of oil and gas to be extracted in a certain area is predictable, according to Fish and Wildlife in their biological opinion for the Willow Project. So they can predict the amount of emissions that will be produced, and therefore they can predict an approximation of how much sea ice is going to melt. These predictions cannot accurately be portrayed in a 5-year period, but with climate change being the biggest threat to polar bears, the agency that is supposed to protect them should be taking that into account before authorizing company activities that are likely to have long-term negative effects on polar bears. My second proposed solution is to add a subsection to the Marine Mammal Protection Act that stipulates, similar to the first solution, if the nature of the activities proposed is known to produce emissions that will have long-term effects outside the location where the drilling operations will occur, that those impacts need to be considered, and the service should not be limited to only considering potential harm within the limited geographic region. While the service should still consider the impact to bears who are physically near activity operations, that should not be the only consideration. Lastly, you might be wondering if such a small change like amending this law is even worth it. Well, a similar argument was made by the EPA in Supreme Court case Massachusetts versus EPA, which involved regulating emissions from new vehicles. The court said, the EPA's argument rests on the erroneous assumption that a small incremental step, because it is incremental, can never be attacked in a federal judicial forum. Agencies, like legislatures, do not generally resolve massive problems in one fell regulatory swoop. And I would agree. Polar bears need all the help they can get, and they are worth it. Since I have a few minutes left, I'm just going to talk a little bit about this paper process per Priscilla. But first, I just want to say that, that this is the third student convention and animal conference that I've been to. And this is also the same exact room that I met Piper in 2 years ago. We saw each other again at the last conference, and now we're both in the LLM program and both happen to be presenting today. So I just wanted to say how neat it is that this conference really does connect people and it shows how small the animal law community really is. But back to the paper. I did not know right out of the gate what I wanted to write about. I signed up for the independent study because I knew that would be my opportunity to write something about polar bears. And I could research some legal issues about polar bears, but specifically, I had no idea what I wanted to write about. And that's where the research came in. I started with Lexis and used very broad search terms. I literally started with polar bears to see what would come up. Eventually, I found the cases that I talked about. And when I was reading them, I was fuming. With all the science about climate change and how much of an impact it's having on polar bears, how could the courts be so contradictory in their discussions? That's when I found my topic and decided that if courts weren't going to change, the law needs to. So if there are any animal law issues that make you fume or bothering you and you wish things were different, research it. Find out where the problems are and see what you can come up with for solutions. You might not know what that is right out of the gate. It might take a lot of research. If there's a class that allows you to do that, great. If not, look into doing an independent study like I did. It's so helpful to have someone, a supervisor or professor, to talk about your thoughts with. My supervisor listened to all my, let's call them concerns about the court cases, but was able to help give me perspective. And she had me think about the issues and what those really were and what I wanted to do to fix them. And by the end of the semester, I had written this paper. I do want to say a big thank you to Professor Jennifer Charamboli at Suffolk University, who is watching right now. I couldn't have written this paper without you, so thank you. So at those last two student conventions, I watched students present their papers, and I thought that was so cool. They took something that they were passionate about, put the work in, and then shared it with us. And I wanted to do that, but I had no idea how to go about submitting my paper, when the deadline was, nothing. So as Priscilla said before, follow the Instagram. That's where I saw the call for papers. And the submission process is also anonymous, and it is reviewed by attorneys in the animal law field. So it's a really neat process. For anyone considering submitting a paper, this is your sign to do it. If you have any questions about polar bears or the LLM program, I'm happy to talk about it. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is still Mason Liddell, still a 3L at Colorado Law. Not everything changes that quickly. Today, I'm going to the cutting edge, or one of the cutting edges of animal law, to a place where people debate over whether presentations like this one are worth the effort, I think. I'm going to talk about rights of nature and animal rights. Specifically, I'm going to talk about Happy the elephant. That's just an elephant. But I'm going to talk about Happy the elephant, and I'm going to talk about the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. These are two cases that are ostensibly failures for their respective movements, or at the very least at first glance, but there's still a lot of information that you can get from them. Now, before I get into it, I want to talk briefly about why I picked this topic. Thank you, Priscilla. It was mostly two reasons. The first one is that I love philosophy. You know, these are two very heavily philosophical ideas, and I love the idea of watching something turn from like an abstract academic idea into something very real that really brought all of us here and a lot more people here. I just think that's really exciting, and it's really cool to watch that development. And then the other one is I legitimately don't know where I stand on these issues. I don't know if the rights of nature is a good idea. I don't know if it will do the things that people hope it will do. And it seems like a good way to maybe get a better opinion is to learn about it. You know, if you're going to spend dozens or hundreds of hours working on a paper, you might as well be legitimately interested in the topic. So that would be my advice there. All right. So here is the plan for the next 25 or so minutes, give or take. First, I'm going to give you some background on each case. Second, I'm going to analyze the reasoning provided by the judges in those cases as they turn down the requests being made by the rights activists. Third, I'm going to compare the reasoning between those two cases. And from that comparison, I am going to conclude that an incrementalist animal rights framework is superior to a rights of nature framework, at least for the purposes of this type of analysis. Fourth, I'll discuss some of the problems with that conclusion. And finally, I will wrap up this presentation. So let's get into it. If you are not familiar with these cases, I think it is extremely important to understand the philosophies and the movements that each one comes out of. The rights of nature movement, or the theory behind it at least, is the idea that nature is not a mere thing. It has rights, or it should have rights under the law. And the idea here is that, you know, if you look at climate change, if you look at biodiversity collapse, the traditional nature protection statutes we have, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, what have you, they've failed. They've demonstrably failed. It's not good enough. It didn't fix all the problems. We need something else. Try rights of nature. Or at the very least, it might be a solution. It's better than a demonstrable failure. And the idea here is to give nature something a little bit more concrete than just, you know, however much particulate matter of this kind is allowed in this river. It's something much broader than that. It's supposed to be a broad protection, but I think you can ask, what protection are we actually talking about? What is getting this protection? And these are really good questions, but they don't have good answers, or maybe they have too many good answers and people haven't settled on it. And that's the reason why a lot of people, environmentalists included, are concerned about the rights of nature. What does nature mean? What is nature? Is it a forest? Is it a species of tree? Is it an individual tree? And maybe it's a wolf, maybe it's one wolf, but is it a dog? Because humans have meddled in that genome. Is that still nature? Like there are fuzzy borders there. And then there's a question about what rights nature is supposed to get. Are we talking about, like, I don't know, are we talking about something that's going to be as distinct as a right to free speech? Or are we just going to complain about, like, well, you know, nature is supposed to have XYZ thing. They're going to be vague, they're going to be incoherent, they're going to be uncertain. And when they are certain, you wind up with other problems. You wind up with, for example, a right being far too broad. You know, we have something that's vague and it's now confusing and it's asserting its authority over everything. This is something I'm going to explore in Lake Erie Bill of Rights. And when you have something asserting that much authority over other stuff, you run into problems of overbreadth. And when you have overbreadth, you have judges that get upset at you and then they strike down, I believe, every single rights of nature law that's ever been brought to court in America. And that's not a great track record because judges are afraid of that overbreadth. They're afraid of how much these things might prove. And because of that, rights of nature has become symbolic law. You don't pass it because you want to do something. You pass it because you want to say what your values are. And it doesn't have to be that way, but that's kind of the status quo of rights of nature law. Now, second, animal rights is, at the risk of oversimplifying it, and please forgive me, but animal rights is the idea that animals are due some level of moral consideration, especially as it pertains to human decision-making. Now, the exact amount or type of moral consideration we're talking about varies person to person, and that's fine. That doesn't matter for the purposes of this presentation, which is good for me. But it is important here to distinguish it from animal welfare. A rights activist, just like with rights of nature, might say that animals should have a right in the same way that I have a free speech right. It's a little bit vague, it's a little bit unclear, but it's pretty powerful. Now, this doesn't mean animals are supposed to have free speech rights, right? The idea is that, as I believe the Non-Human Rights Project puts it, it's not human rights for chimpanzees, it's chimpanzee rights for chimpanzees. Maybe chimps have a right to be free from cruelty. That doesn't mean that they need to be able to vote. Animal rights is that idea of guaranteeing a broader interest. And the juxtaposition here to animal welfare is that animal welfare, like the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, or if we think environmentally like the Clean Water Act, it's specific. It's getting you extra square inches in a cage, or it's letting cows out into the pasture for a certain amount of time per day. It's measurable. And the reason that some rights activists want to move away from that framework is because if you look at factory farms, you look at biodiversity collapse again, you see, perhaps, arguably, demonstrable failures. You need something stronger. It's failed. It hasn't done what we need it to do, and we need it to do more, so try something else, try rights. But of course, there's criticisms with this movement. There's plenty of them. The biggest one is that a lot of people just fundamentally disagree. They say animals don't have rights and kind of end the conversation there. If we get academic with it, the driving theory behind that, I would say, is probably social contract theory. The idea that in order to have a right yourself, you need to be able to respect the rights of others. So it's a give and a take. It's a reciprocal relationship, and animals cannot have rights because they can't respect my rights. Other concerns are more practical. The slippery slope is a big issue that's brought up pretty frequently. If an elephant can get habeas rights, can a dog vote? And no, I don't think that follows, but it's a concern that people have. And I think if I put it more charitably, the idea here is that if we don't have a way to restrain what rights animals are going to get, you might get a ruling for habeas rights for an elephant that completely upturns the entire meat industry or the biomedical industry. And maybe that's good, maybe that's what you want, but that's going to scare a lot of judges, because when the options are the status quo or single-handedly overturn American agriculture, I can give you a guess on which one they're going to go with. So ruling for animals in such and such a way without limiting it might have enormous social consequences, and judges are uncomfortable with that. That's substance. Then there's these more, procedural isn't the right word, but it's more about how animal rights are argued, concerns. Based on the arguments in Animal Liberation, which is one of the foundational philosophical texts for the movement, a lot of modern animal rights activists say that advocating for animals is like advocating for people of color or for LGBTQ people, because those groups have been unjustly discriminated against in the past, just like animals are now. And a lot of people say that this denigrates the memory of those people, of those past struggles, compares them to animals, and isn't something that we should accept or tolerate in this movement or in modern society. It's a problem with the way that you're making your argument, as opposed to the actual ends that you are trying to argue for. So let's move on to the cases that represent these movements, starting with the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. In 2014, a bloom of toxic algae takes over Lake Erie, thanks to excess agricultural runoff. And Toledo, Ohio declares a state of emergency, shuts down its municipal water for 3 days, leaving 500,000 people without any tap water. Understandably, the community didn't like that. They organized, they passed a charter amendment called the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, or LEBOR, and I'm probably going to say that half a dozen different ways, so apologies for that as well. But the idea here, the rights that it has, and it's written right up there, Lake Erie and the Lake Erie watershed possess the right to exist, flourish, and naturally evolve. The Lake Erie ecosystem shall include all natural water features, communities of organisms, soil, as well as terrestrial and aquatic sub-ecosystems that are a part of Lake Erie and its watershed. And then one day after it was passed, it was challenged in court, and it was pretty quickly struck down without much of a fight. It lost very, very badly. The ruling judge said that it violated due process rights for a number of reasons. Primarily, it lacked clarity. Without clarity, you have public policy concerns. For example, if I pick a single flower from the Lake Erie watershed, have I now disrupted its right to flourish or naturally evolve? I mean, maybe, I don't really know. It's a part of the community of organisms, so potentially, I couldn't tell you. And then you have other issues with federalism. This is where the clarity is overbroad. You have Toledo, Ohio, now telling Ohio that it's not allowed to do anything within the Lake Erie watershed that violate these rights. So you're turning that relationship on its head, because Toledo gets its power from Ohio. It can't turn that around and tell Ohio what it can and cannot do. And then on top of this, LEBOR has some pretty strong enforcement provisions. So now that means you can have anybody suing basically anybody for almost any act that takes place within the Lake Erie watershed. And you can see why maybe judges didn't like that. That's creating some arbitrary enforcement and some pretty severe arbitrary enforcement. And not to spoil too much, but you might realize that some of these parallel the concerns about rights of nature more generally. Moving on, in 1971, Happy the elephant was captured in the wild and sold to an amusement park, essentially, in California. And then in 1977, she was transferred to the Bronx Zoo. And she has lived in the Bronx Zoo ever since then, up until today. She's not doing so well today, and since 2006, she's been living in solitude, more or less. So hoping to give Happy a better life, the Non-Human Rights Project, NHRP, as I will probably be calling them, sued the Bronx Zoo, saying that Happy has or should have a right to the writ of habeas corpus. And what they're really saying here is that Happy should be removed from the zoo and put in an elephant sanctuary. She has the right to be living out the rest of her life in that elephant sanctuary. But habeas in New York requires that you are a person. You are persons. Now, it's important to clarify here, personhood doesn't mean humanity. Government agencies, corporations, ships are all pretty frequently given personhood under the law. And then vice versa is true. Humanity doesn't mean personhood. If you think of a fetus, or at the very least like a human fetus, that's a human, but that is not frequently a person under the law. So the court rules that habeas is a right that belongs to humans because they are humans. It's circular, but that's the conclusion they draw. Now, it makes this based off a handful of legal and practical reasons. First, they say that animals can't respect my rights, and therefore they do not have rights themselves. It's reciprocity. It's the social contract. We know it. Happy can't have habeas rights because she can't respect mine. Second, they said that habeas requires a legal confinement under the law, which is absolutely true. Nobody contests that. And Happy is an animal. She's legally considered property, which means that her captivity is completely constitutionally and statutorily legal. And the NHRP's only argument here was to say that it should be illegal under the common law. So it's up to judges to decide that Happy is illegally detained here. And the judges said, look, there's no precedent. We can't possibly rule in your favor without any precedent. This would make huge changes to the way society operates, and we're just not comfortable with that. Which gets me into the third issue, these substantial real-world effects. The dissents here framed the issue differently. They said that this is just one court case about letting one elephant potentially get habeas rights, just for a hearing. We're not talking about that much. And then the majority framed it a completely different way. They said that this is, quote, a sweeping pronouncement of non-human animal personhood, which is not language that you want when you're trying to get a specific ruling in your favor. It's going to upend the relationship between humans and animals. And then finally, the dissents engaged in those human-animal comparisons that I talked a little bit about earlier. They were emphasizing the humanity almost of Happy, saying, you know, she's intelligent, she's capable of incredible things cognitively, she has all these morally relevant features, and habeas has been used flexibly. It's been used flexibly to recognize people whose humanity and personhood wasn't recognized under the law. Talking about enslaved people, talking about women, talking about children. The writ of habeas corpus has been used on those groups of people before they were legally considered people. And they say that the same thing should be considered here, or at the very least, we should think about applying habeas so flexibly that it could possibly apply to Happy. And the majority countered, saying, no, this is an odious comparison, is their language. You cannot compare an animal to those groups of people. It's simply disgusting. It was essentially their argument for a substantial portion of the majority. And so Happy lost. These are two flawed, but at the very least, apparently well-meaning arguments. So the question now is, what can they give us for the future? Well, from comparing the two cases, I drew my ultimate conclusion. An animal rights framework is more likely to succeed in building case law to protect animals and nature because it can do so clearly and incrementally. There's a lot of hurdles to success in pretty much any case that's going to court. And you want to minimize the number of hurdles that you're having. And I believe that animal rights can do that for one particular reason, one primary advantage. It's about the type of entity that you are seeking to protect. Let's look at how Happy and Lake Erie are different in practice. For Libor, the court wasn't sure about two things. It wasn't sure what types of protections Libor was actually granting, and maybe a little bit more ridiculously, it wasn't sure what was getting those protections. It didn't know what the protected entity was. If we start with the first one, these rights are just vague. I mean, what does exist, flourish, and naturally evolve mean? Like I mentioned, picking a single plant, with just that one example, we can get pretty strange with it. If this is like an invasive species, I'm now destroying that plant's ability to exist, but maybe I'm helping the communities of organisms naturally evolve, but maybe it's too late for that because humans already introduced this species. So maybe now just letting it go in the status quo is natural evolution. Like, I don't know. None of these terms were defined. It's pretty unclear. And that's exactly the issue here. If you take it at face value, this is really strong language, and it might prevent any interaction with the lake or with its watershed, which is doubly problematic because now you essentially have Toledo asserting its authority not just over Ohio, but over Canada. And as to what's being protected, according to Libor, it's Lake Erie and its watershed. That's great. But these are enormous dynamic entities comprised of innumerable parts. They're incomprehensibly large, and worse than that, they are constantly changing. This is a little silly, bear with me for a second here, but a watershed is the area around a body of water where all the water eventually drains into that body, more or less. And Libor departs from that definition. They say that a watershed actually includes plants, animals, soils, ecosystems, communities of organisms, and anything else that's found within that area. So now you have the narrower traditional definition of watershed. You have Libor's much broader definition of watershed that I already covered is pretty unclear in what it's actually including in the first place. And then to make matters even worse, Lake Erie and its watershed vary day to day. They're literally changing, and they're changing pretty substantially, right? Climate change, the acceleration of land use in that area mean that water isn't draining to the same places that it used to be draining. So the exact entity being protected is liable to change. And I get that these are marginal uncertainties, but the margins here are huge. Lake Erie is 10,000 square miles, and its watershed is 30,000 square miles. So not only does this enormousness mean that it's harder to conceive of them as a singular entity, but it means that any marginal uncertainty about what qualifies as Lake Erie and its watershed is magnified by the sheer size of those margins. And then by contrast, Happy the elephant is an elephant. And like, I get that that's kind of a little tongue in cheek, but like, that's actually a pretty core part of this ruling, I think. The court knew exactly what Happy the elephant was. The court knew exactly what habeas corpus was. And the court knew exactly how habeas would apply to Happy the elephant. It just disagreed with the argument, but it understood it, it got it, it knew what they were saying. So think of the implications of this difference. You know, in Colorado, for example, no biases, the first-degree murder is defined as followed. A person commits the crime of murder in the first degree if after deliberation and with the intent to cause the death of a person other than himself, he causes the death of that person. Now, based on this text, you can plausibly argue about whether killing an elephant does constitute murder. Depends on what you're counting as a person for this analysis. And you can definitely, given the weight, you can definitely have an argument about whether it should constitute murder. But at the very least, the concept of murdering an elephant makes sense in a way that the concept of murdering a lake doesn't. You know, more relevantly, consider Libor's right to exist. The point at which an elephant ceases to exist, I think, is pretty clear. Not a lot of people will fight you on this. It's probably when the elephant dies. But the point at which a lake ceases to exist gets a little bit trickier. Is it when all the water's gone, or maybe just enough that it becomes a pond? Or maybe, you know, Lake Erie's big. Maybe it's when it becomes a bunch of smaller lakes, depending on that underwater topology. Like, I don't know. And there are answers. These aren't unanswerable questions in law and in science. But it's more argumentation. It's more layers that you have to fight your way through and more times that you have to get the judge to agree with you. And you already have a Herculean lift. So animal rights brings this advantage of clarity because you're protecting a singular discrete entity. And when you set yourself up to protect that singular entity from the outset, that's going to pay dividends down the line when you have other debates over, for example, federalism or the separation of powers, which were both issues featured in these cases. The animal rights framework has this advantage because of the things that it's protecting. Now, of course, there are problems here, and there are unique problems here. The odious comparison is probably the biggest one. Remember, the majority in Happy's case admonished the dissent for using these past expansions of habeas corpus to women, to people of color, to children, as a justification for potentially expanding it to Happy. But the dissent's arguments here go all the way back to the origin of the modern animal rights movement. They go all the way back to Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, where he said that humans have been discriminating within humanity forever, based on morally irrelevant characteristics, gender, race, sexuality. Those are not morally relevant characteristics. And he adds species to that list. He says species isn't a morally relevant characteristic. We should not be discriminating against individuals based on their species. So these comparisons are baked into the DNA of the modern animal rights movement. They provide a huge amount of the moral and philosophical underpinning of the movement, and they can be really awkward or difficult to walk away from. But at least now, frequently when these comparisons are made, they're either outright racist or they're at least inviting accusations of racism, and neither of those are going to help your case. These are both hugely problematic and pretty obviously so. Even though animal rights might bring that advantage of clarity, that doesn't mean it's clarity everybody's going to like, and this is a good example of when it might be time to think about new approaches. Incrementalism, though, is a different problem. This is an issue that animal rights activists and environmentalists might have with the framework that I'm putting forward here. The idea is just, it's not moving fast enough, right? The clock is ticking, climate change is happening, slaughterhouses are awful, and we need to do something now. And I get that, and I'm sympathetic to that, right? People want to immediately upset economic and political systems that are exploiting workers, animals, the environment, and a lot else. But that's kind of exactly the problem. Courts have a lot of institutional limitations. You have stare decisis, you have prudential standing, you have judicial restraint. There's a lot of reasons that courts don't want to or can't make big society-altering decisions. They're just bad institutions to go through if you want to immediately make enormous change. That doesn't mean you can't do anything through the courts, and that doesn't mean you should never try to make a big change. It just means that you need to make sure the tool fits the job. And if you're going to the courts, what you need to be doing are something smaller and incremental. And I believe that's where animal rights keeps its advantage, is in the courts. Now, to bring this presentation to a close, I want to reiterate a few things. Throughout the last 25 minutes, I compared these two cases, one representing rights of nature, one representing animal rights. And I get that this is limited to only two cases, two very small sampling sizes, but they effectively represent their movements, I think, both in their virtues and in their flaws. Both cases represent that there's a lot of vagueness in these movements. There's a lot of vagueness in these arguments. And animal rights tackles that issue better because it's individually addressing static, discrete entities that there can't really be argumentation around, as opposed to rights of nature, which is dealing with these larger, more conceptual entities. And that kind of makes sense. It makes sense that the law works better for discrete creatures because a lot of it is written to protect discrete creatures, individual humans. So it tracks that an individual non-human animal would slot into that framework better. Now, there's a common thread here for rights activists of all kinds, or really just anybody trying to change the status quo. It's that when you are trying to change the way that things are, you need to be conscious and you need to be cautious as you put your arguments forward. Whether that's about avoiding procedural hurdles or it's about avoiding uncertainty over what rights are being given, what effects it will have, what protects or what is receiving those protections, there will be uncertainty. So it's up to you to set those questions up to be more easily answered from the outset. And animal rights keeps that advantage of clarity in the law. Thank you very much.
My name is Piper Blank. Thank you so much for being here and listening to all three of our presentations. I hope it's the last one. I am interesting enough to keep you awake a little bit longer. I am going to be talking to you today about the creation of ambulance systems for animals. And I would also like to introduce my number one gal, Hiccup. Hiccup, can you give the crowd a little wave? Can you wave? Wave. Good job. And before I would begin, I would like to give a brief warning that I will be referencing companion and wild animals in distress, but I will not have any sort of disturbing images. So I hate to pull you away from the cuteness that is Hiccup, but I want to tell you a little bit more about me, which is the next button, this one. Okay. And my paper. So I am from California Bay Area, San Francisco. I got my JD from the University of San Francisco School of Law. Shout out to my USF peeps. And I just graduated this past May, and I am now a Brooks Institute LLM fellow at the Animal Law program at Lewis and Clark, which is amazing. I highly recommend. And I was inspired with the topic for this paper before I even decided to go to law school. One day I was driving home from work with my partner. This is when I was working as a veterinary technician, and the car in front of us hit a baby deer. We stopped to help, and I could hear the deer's lungs filling with fluid, and I knew it wasn't going to make it. We tried animal control, but they were closed. So we called the non-emergency police line. A police officer did respond, but when we told him that the deer had passed, he said it was probably for the best, put his hand on his gun, and said, otherwise I would have had to take care of it. Now, I was ready to give this police officer a piece of my mind, but my partner held me back so I didn't get into too much trouble, and we extracted ourselves from the situation and left. But the experience stayed with me. Not only was it incredibly traumatizing to have witnessed, but it got me thinking, why was this the officer's response? What if it had been a dog or a cat? Would it have been the same? Why was there no one that we could call that would care about what happened to this animal, that wanted to try to save this animal, or even just allow it to have a peaceful and pain-free passing? Once I was in law school, and having found the animal law field, I knew that it was the perfect opportunity to explore the laws that created this gap and the idea that had come to me for a solution. So that is what I will be talking about today. And as I mentioned, I'm from California, so the paper is going to be focused on California laws. So I will start by discussing the current laws that govern animal control. And we're going to start with the state level. So there are 3 important codes that contribute to the regulation of animal control on a state level: the Health and Safety Code, the Food and Agriculture Code, and the Penal Code. I'm going to start with the Health and Safety Code, and it has 2 important sections that I want to point out. The first regulates animal control directly, because this is where you'll find the requirements to become a certified animal control officer. This training includes a course in actual animal care and training in the state laws and the powers and duties of an officer charged with enforcing the laws pertaining to the humane treatment of animals. Who knew? Much of the training to be a certified animal control officer is provided by the California Animal Welfare Association. This is an organization that supports all animal welfare professionals in California, but they mainly support animal control officers and agencies by providing law enforcement training for them. And they also publish a California Animal Law Handbook, which is very interesting if anyone's interested. The second section of the Health and Safety Code that I wanted to point out does not relate directly to animal control, but it is relevant to my topic because it has to do with animals and emergency services. So the Health and Safety Code limits liability for human first responders that voluntarily provide basic medical care to companion animals. So this is a situation where first responders are responding to a human emergency and the companion animals have also been injured. And the first responders have the option to provide care to the companion animals as well. But before the passage of this statute, when they did provide that care, it was in violation of the Veterinary Medical Practice Act because the first responders were unlicensed. So it was actually unlawful veterinary care, and they could face criminal liability. So now the Health and Safety Code limits that liability, and they can provide this care without fear of liability, which is really good because we want them to do that. So next we're going to talk about the Food and Agriculture Code, and this is where you'll find most of the regulations about animal control. It houses more specific animal control statutes, such as statewide spay and neuter requirements for animal controls, shelters, and rescues, as well as regulations about what shelters and animal controls must do with lost companion animals. Excuse me. Another part of the Food and Agriculture Code relates less directly to animal control, but also still important for my topic, is the creation of the California Veterinary Emergency Team. So this is a program that tasks UC Davis with training, supporting, and assisting government and non-governmental agencies in the care and evacuation of animals, both domestic and livestock, during statewide natural disasters. So we're talking about wildfires, hurricanes, which I don't think we get in California, any other sort of natural disaster, earthquakes, we get those, any other sort of natural disasters that you get in California, that is what they do. Last and certainly not least, we have the penal code. I like to analogize that animal control is the law enforcement for animals. Non-animal people will insert a joke here about how they're out arresting animals, but that is not what I mean. Similar to how police enforce the penal code when humans commit crimes, animal control provides additional law enforcement for the anti-cruelty and animal-focused statutes of the penal code to ensure that humans are not harming animals or committing crimes against or with animals. So states are only the big picture. It is really municipal laws or ordinances that are the bread and butter of animal control. Now, I could spend probably 30 minutes talking to you about the nuances of animal municipal ordinances because just like animal controls, they're all structured differently in every different locality around the country, in every state. But I won't subject you to that. But I will give you a brief overview with just one example. In many cases, the municipal ordinances are very similar to the state laws. And in some cases, the state laws actually have provisions that allow the local governments to actually directly adopt the state laws. Most municipal codes will have a specific animal section. For example, in San Francisco, it is Title I of the Municipal Health Code. And within this code, you'll find details of the functions of the Animal Care and Control Department, specific animal control officer duties, dog bite laws, spay and neuter requirements, laws about impounding animals. And while some of the ordinances will regulate animal control directly, many of them do not actually regulate animal control itself and just refer to animal control as the agency that carries them out or enforces them. So all of this to say, there seems to be an abundance of laws that regulate animal control. We have all of these laws, but there's still gaps. So why are these laws not enough? My simple answer is because there's not emergency services for animals. And you might be thinking, but Piper, you just mentioned some types of situations where there is some emergency services for animals. And yes, I did. And yes, there are some specialty cases, such as statewide natural disasters, where animals are considered and will be evacuated. And human first responders can voluntarily provide care to companion animals when a human is also injured. But what about the day-to-day? Or when the animal is the one that is injured? What if, standing up here on this stage right now, Hiccup went into respiratory distress? The closest ER vet is 2 miles away. Do I attempt to carry her to the lobby, wait for the valet, jump in my car, race like a madwoman to the ER vet, endangering my life and further endangering Hiccup's? Without hesitation. But would that be enough? And it is not just this imaginary scenario. Real stories like this are happening out there every day. And I'm going to share some with you. And like I said, these are real stories. A woman's dog had a seizure while her wife was at school with the family's only car. And she had no way to get to the ER vet. So she could only wait out the seizure and treat the dog at the primary vet as soon as possible when she had access to transportation. An elderly couple called an ER vet because their dog was having difficulty breathing, but they were unable to drive and had no family that could bring them to the hospital. And unfortunately, I do not know what happened to their dog. In these situations, what do? You could call 911, but they're going to tell you that they're just for humans. The ER vets can't come to you because of liability issues. Animal control will tell you where the nearest vet hospital is and will try to give you some tips over the phone of, what you can do, like home remedies and stuff. But when your dog is having difficulty breathing, there's really not much you can do at home. And animal control may, depending on where you live, be able to help with transport. But if they do, sometimes that can involve surrendering them to animal control, which means that you likely will never get them back. And even if it doesn't involve surrendering them to animal control, they don't have the ability to treat your dog or companion animal en route. So the assistance with transportation still might not be enough. By a show of hands, how many people in this room have companion animals? Okay, keep your hands up, sorry, keep your hands up. Keep your hand up if you consider them to be a member of the family. Okay, I don't think I saw a single hand go down. In a study, you can put your hands down now. In a study done in 2023, Pew Research Center found that 97% of people with companion animals in the US consider them to be members of the family. 97% of people. And 51% of people with companion animals consider them to be as much a member of the family as a human member. Don't tell my family, but Hiccup is, number one. It is traumatizing when a family member experiences a medical emergency, especially when there's no way to get help or you can't get to help in time. So that is why these laws are not enough. There's a gap around these animal-centered emergencies, and it needs to be filled for the sake of the animals, and I guess for the sake of the humans too. So now, what can we do to fill the gap that needs to be filled? My proposal is Veterinary Emergency Response Team, or as I like to call it, VERT. And I would like to give a shout out to my brother who helped me come up with the name. VERT is a system of ambulances that fills this gap by providing immediate veterinary care en route to the hospital. So what does this actually look like? First and foremost, the most important piece is the ambulances, clearly. Now I'm talking about human-sized ambulances with the same capabilities, including oxygen, a gurney, but it would be stocked with veterinary supplies. This ambulance would have lights and sirens, and most importantly, traffic privileges, the same as any human ambulance. The next piece would be the dispatch center. There would be multiple centers located throughout the specific municipality, depending on its size, similar to 911 dispatch centers, and they would be operated 24/7. The number for VERT would be a 3-digit number similar to 911, but for example, 711. The dispatchers would be trained animal control officers, have specialized emergency veterinary hospital client service representative training. Sorry, that's a mouthful. And some animal care training to be able to assist someone over the phone if need be until VERT arrives, depending on the type of injury that's happening. When the dispatchers receive a call, they would send the nearest ambulance team. And the actual ambulance teams would be made up of 3 people: a registered veterinary technician, 2 certified veterinary assistants, and one of those will act as a driver. And this 3 number is really important for animal handling. It's always best to handle an animal with at least 2 people, and then the 3rd person is there for anything that might go wrong. VERT will be for any injury or emergency that requires immediate care or is life-threatening. And that means that they will likely be taking the companion animal to the hospital, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. If the injury is treatable on site and you can keep your companion animal, we love that. We want them to stay in their comfort environment, and that is great. But oftentimes it will mean that they will have to go to the hospital. Most of these calls will be about companion animals, but this does not mean that VERT would only be for companion animals. VERT could respond to a call similar to the story that inspired this paper or other wildlife injuries. It is not just for companion animals. But some examples of other possible companion animal injuries that VERT could respond to are a dog or cat being hit by a car, a dog showing signs of bloat, bleeding from the nose, mouth, or rectum, or any sort of difficulty breathing. This is obviously a non-exhaustive list, and there are lots of other types of emergencies where VERT could be needed. Once VERT responds to the call and gets the animal loaded into the ambulance, apologies, they will have all supplies to begin treatment en route to the hospital, which is key. Treatment begins on site right away. You're en route to the hospital and you're already being treated. You have traffic privileges, so you can get there within minutes. Those minutes are key. It will also be important for animal control or the county to have contacted the hospital and the ER hospitals and made arrangements with the vets to be able to bring the calls there and arrange that ahead of time so that there's an understanding of, within the system. So how to take this amazing but slightly crazy in a good way idea and make it a reality? One way would be legislation, something I've been working on currently with Professor Russ Mead. I don't know if he's still in the room, but shout out to him if he's in here. And for it to be a part of animal control, it would be best to do the legislation county by county. Doing it this way, there are a lot of nuances to the program as I designed it that might not transfer over through legislation. So it would likely end up looking different in each county, similar to how animal control is different in each county. And so it will likely end up reflecting each system and how they want to implement it. Another option, which I will also be working on with Professor Russ Mead, is a nonprofit that brings in the ambulances and is able to have all the program nuances and works with animal controls or even government and non-governmental agencies. And a benefit of doing it this way is that it has the potential to have an even bigger impact by working beyond just animal control. So I think the biggest question is, who the heck is going to pay for all this? There are a few different options. People could pay for it similar to how they pay for human ambulances. It could be part of pet insurance. There are a lot of pet insurance options out there. It could be part of insurance plans. There's always donations, although this would likely be very expensive. So I'm not sure that that is sustainable as the only funding source. And if it goes the legislation route, it could be paid with a small $1 flat county tax in each county. But it is my goal and hope that VERT is free service for everyone so that it is accessible to everyone, because it should be accessible to everyone, just like human ambulances. And it is my dream that VERT someday becomes a reality to give our companion animals in emergency situations a fighting chance. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
I was one of the reviewers of the papers, and it's so great to have faces to names, and the presentations are just really make the concepts become alive. So thank you for each of those presentations and really thoughtful ideas. We're now going to open this up to questions. If you would like to ask a question, you can go up to one of the mics, and then we'll also have a virtual option. So if anyone who's watching at home has a question that will get to me through my counterparts at the end of the room. I'll start it off. This question is for you, Olivia. How do you think the overturn of the Chevron deference will impact future litigation and advocacy for polar bears?
That's a good question. The case that she's referencing is Loper Bright Enterprises. And I did some research on that, and it seems like it's more of a legal interpretation, like an interpretation of law when the law is ambiguous and the agencies are interpreting that. That's what Loper specifically seemed to have overturned. And this is more of a factual looking at the facts and best scientific evidence of how a permit would impact a species. So it doesn't seem like that overturning would have that big of an impact on the polar bears.
Okay, well, we'll get another question then going. This one's for you, Mason. Does the animal rights framework keep the advantage of clarity if the rights of nature were being given to individual entities like an individual mountain or tree?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to that question is probably not, maybe to some extent, but either way, you're still learning a lesson from the animal rights movement about what should be protected, right? A lot of rights of nature laws were passed by one of two organizations. I think it's like 75% were passed by one of two organizations with their support and with their drafting. And their drafting is pretty similar. So you get all of these extremely vague laws. And I think that that's really the lesson to take away is I don't think this is something intrinsic to animal rights. You know, you could protect a species and in that way build vagueness back in. But this is more something about how they are done in practice in America as you wind up with rights of nature going really broad and dangerously so, and animal rights going usually more narrow. But I think really the lesson here is less like, oh, animals specific, nature vague, and more just go narrow for whatever you're going. You want something discrete and you want something that fits into traditional law a little bit more neatly.
Thank you.
Hi, so this is a question for Piper. I loved your presentation. Let me just preface with that. But my first question would be about when you were considering talking about the wild animals, like you were mentioning that deer story and things like that. How does this plan that you're considering consider rehabilitation and release of more wild animals? Are you planning to keep them for a long time until they've recovered? Does this become more of a rehabilitation process? How much is really this policy would this cover?
That's a really good question. So I did actually consider that. In California, we have something called the Lindsay Wildlife Museum. And it's not well, it is a museum, but it's also a rehabilitation center. And so my thought for that, it's a hospital and rehabilitation center. So my thought for that was like for if somebody comes across an injured bird, because they mostly focus on like hawks and birds and stuff like that. So if someone comes across an injured hawk, and they call Vert, and Vert comes and picks up the hawk, they would take it to someplace like Lindsay Wildlife Museum, where they're able to appropriately care for the species and rehabilitate and then release back into the wild. And it would be up to that place to determine if the animal was not able to be released back into the wild and needed to be cared for the rest of its life. And I think that there are a lot of places, at least my hope would be that there are places out there that are similar to Lindsay Wildlife Museum that are doing that type of work. And Vert would kind of keep a list of those places and be able to contact them when those situations arose.
Okay, I have a bit of a follow-up if that's
Sure.
all right. Regarding that kind of contractual relationship between Vert and a wildlife rehabilitation center. Is that something that would be covered within Vert's actual policy proposal? Would there be some kind of like true contractual relationship? How does the kind of funding get split between the two? Is one paying the other? Who's the taxpayer's money going to? Maybe that's a bit of a too broad a question, but just that kind of partnership, how legally bound is that?
Yeah. I'd like to put it within the policy. That's how I would, that would be my preference. And I think in terms of the funding, it would be like any funding, any way that VERT is getting funding, that funding would be going to VERT, but like we could make like a donation to Lindsay Wildlife to contribute, or like if VERT picks up the animal, we could cover the expenses for that animal or something like that. Like it could definitely be worked out. There's still some nuances to be worked out, but I definitely want to include those types of relationships in the policy, which is why maybe legislation might be difficult, because those types of relationships are difficult to work out in policy, as I'm learning through Russ Mead's class. And the funding is kind of more contractual, but it would be, VERT would have its funding separated, and then we would work out something else on the side between those other organizations that we would be working with.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question is for you, Olivia. If your proposed changes were made and protections were enforced, what would the successful outcome look like?
A successful outcome would mean that the service actually considers all the best scientific evidence, and that they would not be approving all of these permits for the incidental takes of the marine mammals, because if they looked past the 5-year period or outside the geographic scope, they would see that industrial activities are causing direct harm and causing more than a negligible impact on polar bears long-term. And so they would hopefully not be approving these permits in the first place and then not getting to court at all.
Thanks.
Hi. Thank you so much. My name is Grace and my question is for Mason. Thanks for your paper and great presentation. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the conclusion that incrementalism through animal rights cases holds a lot of promise for potentially changing the broader system of how animals are viewed under the law. And that question comes from my interest that kind of came up in your presentation around the tension between trying to create more of a systems-based or holistic approach to understanding huge existential ecological problems. Like climate change is a big existential issue that involves an entire system and framework. And so it sounds like the rights of nature approach tries to address that and seek out a more of a systems theory approach to the law, but you talked about a lot of the legitimate drawbacks of this. So I'm wondering if you think that the incrementalism approach with animal rights could still work toward an eventual shift in the paradigm of how we deal with these big threats. Like, can these cases help us get a little bit further away from reductionism and toward a more holistic view of the environment and humans and non-humans? Or would it be more working within the existing system to bring more rights to animals?
Yeah, totally good question. And thank you for your kind words. I appreciate it. Okay, so here's my thought on it. I think that if you are trying to make big changes through the courts, you need a long time span on the order of decades, right? Like there's no better example of this than what's happened in like the lead up to Roe versus Wade and then the fall of Roe versus Wade. And I originally had a section in my paper that was about that, and that was way too long and way too much detail about something that's mostly irrelevant. But I think there's like an important lesson there, right? These are really strong protections. If you can get them through the courts, they're really strong protections. They're just hard to get, and you need to be smart about how you get them. And so I think if you are fully for rights of nature, if you are fully for animal rights, then you need to approach these things one step at a time. You need to work backwards from your conclusion and realize that you're not going to be able to say an elephant is a person and set every animal free from the slaughterhouses. Thank you, judge. Like that will not happen. End the sentence there. But you might be able to get something small. And this has been actually kind of what my line of thought was with other papers. So shout out to Bella at USF, because they will be publishing another paper that I got coming out that I think kind of answers this question about what next steps do you want to be taking. And my thought with that one is, how do you limit the slippery slope, right? Like what can we do to restrict the concerns about these practical consequences? And I think that that's the approach you have to take for all of these problems, is you kind of just have to go one by one and say, all right, here is the issue that they're having. How can I address this issue? Okay, perfect. Moving on to the next step. And you just have to break it down one step at a time, and you have to be willing to be flexible, because sometimes you're going to get things that you don't like, but oftentimes if you give it enough time, then new cases, contradictory cases will bubble up, and you can use those things to your advantage and those tensions to your advantage to try and make better law. But if you're doing it through the courts, it has to take that really long time span.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Piper, this one's for you. So we have this issue in Oregon a lot where if you bring an invasive species to a rehab center, the animal will experience euthanasia. So how do you reconcile a rehabilitation center's approach to that for invasive species with your strategy?
This is a really interesting question because as far as I know, in California, we don't have invasive species. I'm sure we do. I don't know about them. And so this was not something that I considered when I was writing the paper. Actually, Priscilla brought it up to me when we were talking about my paper. And I've given it some thought since then. And I think the issue with the invasive species question is that if it is implemented through the legislative route, there's not really an option, because you have to follow whatever the state or county or whatever the jurisdiction that you're in, whatever their laws are about invasive species is what VERT would have to follow. But a benefit of doing a nonprofit is that the nonprofit could take the invasive species and find someone that's willing to care for it. Priscilla told me about a place in Portland called Dove Lewis who takes invasive species. And so being able to, as a nonprofit, work with other nonprofits that would care for the invasive species would be the goal. And I have not thought of a solution for the legislative route yet. So that's something to think about.
But just as a sort of follow-up, the local wildlife rescue near me brings turtles that veer off course back.
Oh,
And
that's so
that
cool.
seems like a really great way of just bring it back where it's supposed to be. Have you come across any methods that local communities can take to help support the polar bear populations, like in the interim? Like, obviously, you can't stop climate change immediately and make the ice reappear, but like when I was a kid, our town dug up an entire road and put in tunnels for salamanders to cross. Like, are there anything that the local communities can do to help support the polar bear populations that live near them? Like, did you come across any like sort of grassroots efforts that they can do?
Not with my paper, but just with my polar bear interest all my life, a little bit. Because especially with climate change, that bears are being drawn more on the mainland and being in civilization, and there's a lot of human bear conflict. There are, especially in Canada, where most of the polar bears are in North America, there are like non-lethal recommendations of how to deal with a bear. And like there's bear spray. I didn't know about that. And so they do have recommendations that way of kind of how to deal with that. And then there are organizations like Polar Bears International does a lot of education, and they're a science conservation-based organization. They do a lot of education and outreach, so like kind of educating students, and this is all over, so not just where polar bears are, about like what you can do with climate change and how to reduce your impact and learn about bears. But I guess with communities near polar bears, not quite as much. I'll echo Piper's through my class with Russ Mead. The legislation that I'm working on is to ban polar bear hunting in Ontario. Manitoba is the only province territory in Canada that polar bear hunting is illegal. Everywhere else in Canada, it is legal. So want to stop that altogether. But it's interesting that, or not interesting that, that's something that's an effort that people are trying to make, but people will spend $20,000 to go hunt a polar bear in Canada. But I think there should be, and there might be, and I'm happy to actually, that'd be something interesting to look at, and I'm happy to get back to you when I research some more.
It's really cool. It popped into my head when you were talking about it, like the creation of artificial reefs to like create habitats. Could you like create like artificial ice floats like as a temporary stopgap measure? But probably not. Their habitat's probably way too expensive for that.
That's a really interesting thought. There is one habitat like sanctuary in Canada, in Ontario. It's called Cochrane. It's as close to a sanctuary as you get. It's about 43 acres, and there are 3 bears in it. And it's just dedicated to polar bear care. And if you go to their website, it's pretty cool. They have a lot of information about each bear and their names and where they come from and their stories. So yeah, I mean, part of my idea eventually is that there will be more polar bear sanctuaries, and because zoos are just far too small. I could talk about that for a while, but I will not.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, my question's for Mason. So obviously with Singer, you mentioned that he coined speciesism as kind of a new form of discrimination akin to racism, sexism, etc. And something he does in the book is, and this is done a lot with animal rights, Tom Reagan famously, right, is the kind of comparison between animals, non-human animals, and mentally disabled people, right, what we would consider moral patients, to use Reagan's term. And obviously, you know, someone a human who is not necessarily able to claim X, Y, and Z rights, it's not, we as other humans wouldn't deny them those rights either, right? They have right to X, Y, and Z that certain animals simply don't have. And if these animals, if you were to follow this argumentation, take the role of kind of a moral patient, or and they are not provided these rights, that suggests some sort of complete ontological difference between the two. And I'm very curious then, because if that's the case, at what point do you just throw up your hands and say, rights is not the same approach? And I'm very curious in your research, because obviously there are animal liberation approaches that don't revolve around rights. I'm curious what your thoughts, if you've managed to go into explore them a little, and while you're doing this research, what are your thoughts on alternative approaches to animal liberations outside of the rights framework?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Okay, the short answer is I wish I had a better answer. The longer answer is I do definitely have thoughts on this. I've always thought that it's really funny that Peter Singer, the founder in some ways of the animal rights movement, does not believe in rights, right? For those of you who don't really know, he follows this more like consequentialist way of thinking, which is essentially, boiling it really down, you think about the greatest good for the greatest number. Rights aren't a factor. Nobody really has rights. It's just about this utilitarian calculus. And then Tom Regan, who you also mentioned, is much more focused on that traditional rights-based framework about, you know, a right to free speech, but he obviously frames it for animals. Personally, I think that this is one of the issues with the concept of animal rights, with the concept of rights of nature, is I think rights are really tricky to work with, right? Like we even for humans, even for stuff, to stick with it, even for the right to free speech, we don't really know what that means, right? Like that can definitely be invaded. I don't know. I'm in a First Amendment law class right now, and like every day it's just like, oh yeah, no, that's free speech, but you cannot do that. It's just speech, that you're not allowed to do that speech, and like. I think that makes it really hard to be thinking about what is a
right, and how does that actually weigh out here? When I was trying to describe the difference between animal welfare and animal rights, there's kind of a difficulty there because you can frame anything as a right. You can say like a right for a chicken to be held within 70 square inches in their cage or something like that. Great, okay, that's a right. But really this just kind of gets to like the squishiness of language. It's really tricky to try and nail these things down. And that is one advantage, I think, if you're going to take a consequentialist bend that you have, is obviously the empirics are really difficult. It's really hard to say like, ah, yes, I've done all the utilitarian calculus. And if we take this approach, the optimal amount of space for a chicken is 5 square feet per chicken or something like that. That's really hard to prove. But at the very least, there's ostensibly an answer where you can just get into rights battles all day and say like, oh, well, that negative right infringes on my positive right to this, and they're both absolute, so there's nothing you can do, right? Like philosophers will sling mud all day long. And I think that there is something elegant to the consequentialist approach for that reason. But that doesn't mean that I really have a good answer to your discrete question, right? How do you work with that in practice? I think that the honest answer is you take the same approach that we've taken for, the Bill of Rights. You just kind of guess and you say, okay, what we really mean by this is it's just a really strong interest. It's not undefeatable. It's not dispositive and solves all the question. You always err on free speech. It's just a really strong interest that you give a lot of concern to. And that's where I've landed for the moment.
Thank you so much. Again, all of your questions and presentations were wonderful. Thank you everyone for being here, and I'm going to give the mic back to Priscilla for closing remarks.
We will actually be heading into a networking time. So if you haven't submitted your raffle tickets, please go get those submitted. We'll be hosting the raffle in about 30 minutes, but right now you have about an hour to spend networking and getting to know each other, practice those techniques you learned, because tonight at 6 p.m. here is the kickoff for the Animal Law Conference reception. And with me is Kelly Lavinda, my fabulous colleague, and she has a few updates for you.
Thanks, Priscilla. I manage our clerkship, externship, and student volunteer program, and 2 of our programs are already hiring for next summer. I know it's a little early, but we're already thinking about it. So I did pass out some job descriptions, and then each table should have also a piece of paper with a QR code, and that will take you right to our online application. So we're going to break into networking right now. Thank you so much for attending.